I never considered myself a confrontational person. I preferred to keep my head down, do my work, and avoid drama, but everything changed one ordinary Wednesday afternoon at my office job. I was sitting at my desk, typing up a report, when I overheard a hushed conversation from the break room. It was Emily and Tom, two co-workers I thought I knew well. Their voices were low but urgent, like they were discussing something that could shake the walls. Curiosity gnawed at me, so I paused my typing and strained to hear. My heart raced as I caught snippets between their whispers. "He can't find out," said Emily. "We'll both lose everything if he does." Who were they talking about? A million scenarios crashed through my mind, each more bizarre than the last until I finally settled on the most obvious. It must be about our boss, Mr. Jenkins. He had a reputation for being ruthless, but he wasn't the only one in the office with secrets. I stewed in my chair for a few minutes, weighing my options. Should I confront them? Should I ignore it? My gut told me I needed to know more. I snuck into the break room, heart pounding, finding only Emily with her back to me, focused on her phone. I feigned ignorance. "Hey, what's up? You guys sounded intense." Emily jumped, spinning to face me with wide eyes. Nothing. Just, typical office gossip." She shrugged it off, but I could see the tension in her shoulders and the way her hands trembled. I almost backed off, but the thrill of dirt clawed at my conscience. "Really? Because it sounded like you were worried about something significant." I crossed my arms, hopeful my body language would convey a sense of ease. Tom shuffled in seconds later, looking just as uneasy. "What's going on?" he asked, eyes darting between me and Emily. I raised an eyebrow, ready to pounce. "Just trying to get to the bottom of this, whatever it is you two are worried about." Emily bit her lip, glancing at Tom, who shot her a look filled with silent urgency. I should have walked away. I could have let it be, but instead, I pressed harder. "You two clearly think something's about to go down. Is it about Jenkins?" The silence that followed felt heavy and palpable, like a noose tightening around us. "Look, it's complicated," Emily finally stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just forget it. For your own good." My heart raced, but something in my gut felt that I was pressing on the right wound. There was something bigger at play here. Before I could respond, Jenkins himself stormed into the room, his presence commanding. "What's happening here?" he barked, eyes narrowed. In that moment, everything shifted. My blood ran cold, and I struggled for a response. I was just, "Get back to work," he thundered, his eyes flaring with rage. Emily's face paled as Tom swallowed hard, and the tension in the room skyrocketed. I stumbled back from the turmoil swirling around me, retreating to my desk. My mind raced. I hadn't gotten the answers I wanted, but I felt the weight of something ominous lurking beneath the surface. I couldn't shake off the feeling that they were entangled in something far darker. Over the next few days, their behavior twisted further into secrecy, constantly glancing over their shoulders, speaking in hushed voices, and jumping at every noise. It was unsettling, like pieces of a puzzle I needed to complete were desperately missing. I decided to follow them one evening as they left the office, heart thudding in my chest. I trailed them discreetly, hoping I wouldn't get caught. I watched them enter a dimly lit bar a few blocks away. For a moment, I debated turning back, the weight of curiosity pulling at me, but a forceful urge pushed me forward. I took a seat at the back, pretending to sip a drink while they engaged in an animated discussion, their voices low and conspiratorial. As I strained to hear what they were saying, I caught snippets here and there. The files were never meant to leave the building. "If they find out about the numbers, we'll lose everything." Those sentences shattered any doubt I had. This was serious. I slipped out quietly, needing time to process the revelation. I spent that night tossing and turning, my mind racing with what I had discovered. I was on the verge of uncovering some kind of scandal. Should I expose them? What would they lose? What would I potentially gain? It was tempting to consider, until honesty began to churn in my gut, slowly turning the knife. Every few hours, a wave of panic washed over me as I envisioned the consequences of bringing this to light. I tried talking myself out of it. Perhaps it was none of my business. Maybe I should just let it go, but the gnawing feeling persisted. Finally, I succumbed to my instincts as I made a plan to confront Emily the next day when we were working late again. The afternoon dragged, and I felt the pressure mounting within me, muscles tense and thoughts chaotic as I prepared for what I knew had to happen. When the clock hit 6, I caught Emily alone in the break room, filling her mug with coffee. Time slowed down as I gathered my courage. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. She looked at me, eyes wide with suspicion. "About what?" "About Tom, about Jenkins, about whatever you two are hiding." She put her coffee down, glancing around as if fearing someone would overhear. "This isn't the place," she began, but I interrupted her. "No, listen, I can't ignore this. Whatever's going on, it's bigger than just you two, and if it's as dangerous as it sounds." It felt like a dam had broken. Fear flashed in her eyes as she shook her head. "You don't know what you're getting into. You need to walk away. Please." But her plea only made me want to push harder, to find out exactly what they were so afraid of. "I can't do that. I want the truth." For a moment, we stood in silence. The flickering fluorescent lights overhead buzzed like a warning bell, and the air felt charged with unspoken knowledge. "Here we go," she murmured, her shoulders slumping as she braced herself. "All right. But you need to promise you won't tell anyone, at least not until you understand." I nodded, adrenaline surging as I prepared to hear what could turn my world upside down. Emily took a deep breath, eyes darting to the door once more. "Tom and we've been stealing data from Jenkins's clients to sell on the dark web. It started with just a couple of files. We never thought it would escalate like this." I felt every word hit me like a punch, ripping through the protective armor I had convinced myself I wore. My stomach went queasy. "This is..." I trailed off, unable to form a coherent thought. "Why would you do that?" "Money. Pressure. The usual corrupt business reasons. But it's spiraling out of control, and now we're being tracked. If Jenkins finds out, we're done for." A chill ran down my spine. I had stumbled into something horrific, something real that could destroy lives. "So you're not only jeopardizing your jobs, but potentially involving all of us," I began, feeling bile at the back of my throat. "You don't understand. I didn't want to drag anyone else into this, but I'm scared. We've been made. Jenkins has been watching us, and now that you've seen us whispering, he'll know. If he thinks you're a threat..." Emily looked genuinely terrified. I stumbled back, mind racing. How deep had they gone? What would happen if Jenkins turned his attention toward me? I could feel the walls of my safe little world collapsing around me, but I also felt a surge of determination. "I have to go to Jenkins," I declared, shaking my head at her attempt to dissuade me. "This isn't just about you two anymore. It's about what might happen to everyone else if this continues." Emily's eyes widened. "You can't." In that moment, I realized I had stepped into a web of deceit too intricate for me to weave my way out. But I was already too far in to walk away. I rushed out of the break room, heart pounding as I made my way to Jenkins's office. Dread bubbled in me like a volcano ready to erupt. I had become a pawn in a game far larger than myself, yet I felt I had to play my hand. I knocked on his door and pushed it open. "Mr. Jenkins, I need to talk to you. It's serious." His expression was clouded with irritation as he looked up from his screen. "What is it?" "I'm busy." Those words echoed ominously, and I felt the weight of my decision crashing over me. "I've overheard something that could affect the company. I think you need to know about Tom and Emily." The cruel smile that crept across his face chilled my bones. "I like that you're trying to be a good employee. But trust me, you have no idea what you're getting into." I felt like I had walked into a trap, heart racing as the essence of fear sank deeper into me. "They're stealing information," I blurted out. "Selling it. It's dangerous." Jenkins leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers in contemplation. "And how would you know this, exactly?" Panic surged in me as I realized I had no safeguard. I overheard them talking. You have to believe me." His laughter rang through the apocalyptic silence, a cold sound that sent shivers down my spine. "You think I haven't known? I let them play their little game while I kept tabs. Now I have you to add to the mix. How convenient." My heart sank. "What do you mean?" His sharp smile cut through the air. "You're all part of this now. Whether you realize it or not, they were never the players. You are." I stumbled back, cold sweat coating my brow. What can I do? He leaned forward, eyes glinting with malice. You'll do exactly as I say. Or else you'll end up like them. The weight of his words bore down on me like a suffocating blanket. I left his office in a daze, the world spinning around me. He twisted everything into something insurmountable. I was caught in his web now, and my moment of honesty had turned everything into absolute chaos. Days turned into weeks as I spiraled deeper into this madness. I felt trapped, knowing the secrets but feeling powerless to act. Emily and Tom, once my targets of confrontation, had become part of my growing horror. I barely slept, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Then one fateful afternoon, as I typed aimlessly, the office fell silent, an uncanny stillness strung tight as a bowstring. Anxiety crept in like a dark fog, and my heart pounded in my chest. The silence was so heavy that I thought it might suffocate me. Suddenly, the office doors burst open. It was a swarm of dark-suited individuals, their expressions unreadable. Panic ignited like wildfire. They moved through the office with haste, all eyes darting to see what was happening. I felt the blood drain from my face as I realized what was happening. Jenkins, I gasped, recognizing him at the center of the storm, fear painted across his features. He turned, meeting my gaze, and for the first time, I saw something raw in his eyes, a hint of vulnerability amid the chaos. What's going on? I whispered, dread pooling in my stomach. He glanced at me, then looked away. I don't know, he rasped, panic creeping into his voice as they pulled him aside. In that moment, I recognized an escape clause in the chaos. Facing my own fear, I slipped into the shadows of the office, avoiding their gaze. Ellie and Tom were sharing a look across the room, their hardened expressions dissolving into something soft and unreadable. I could feel the fear thickening around me, melding with dread, until it hit me like a truck. This was the curse of honesty that had ensnared us all. A truth laid bare but riddled with pain, and the gravity of it all had pulled us close to ruin. Later that night, as the cacophony of whispers shrouded me, cloaked in darkness, I reflected on what I had learned. The lesson etched itself into my bones, some truths weave a web too tangled for a single person to unravel. I wished I had kept my mouth shut, opting for the comforting silence that had once lulled me. I had confronted what I thought needed addressing, but the reckoning had reached far beyond anything I could control. And while I learned the price of honesty that day, I also learned that sometimes, words can be a double-edged sword, cutting through the air before they cut through your life. Thus, I realized the only way to survive was to lay low, to preserve the lives that remained unscathed, and hope the tides would eventually calm. It was a lesson in honesty, but at a cost I couldn't afford to bear. I turned down a promotion and regretted it, here's why. Here's why. It was a decision I thought I'd never make. I'd worked hard for years, climbing the ladder at the company, sacrificing weekends, late nights, even parts of my personal life just to get ahead. So when my boss finally offered me that long-awaited promotion, the one I'd been dreaming of, I shocked even myself by saying, no. It wasn't impulsive, or at least it didn't feel that way. It was months of grueling work, the stress, and this voice in my head warning me that taking on more might actually lead me further from the life I wanted. And honestly, at that moment, I'd convinced myself that my refusal was about setting boundaries, about having more time to focus on my relationship with Mia, my fiancée, and avoiding that relentless corporate grind I'd seen ruin so many lives around me. But when I told my boss, his face flashed from surprise to something I couldn't quite place, maybe disappointment or maybe something darker. Either way, he said he respected my choice and that the opportunity might still be there later, though he didn't sound convinced. The strange part was, I walked out of that meeting with a weird, unsettled feeling, like I'd made a decision that was going to echo far beyond just that room. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing changes, subtle at first. Meetings I used to be invited to suddenly didn't have my name on the list. Projects I'd spearheaded got shifted to other people without explanation. My boss became distant, almost cold. It wasn't anything overt, nothing you could put a finger on, but there was this sense of being slowly phased out. People I thought were allies, even friends in the office, began treating me differently, as if I was no longer part of the core team. I thought I was being paranoid at first, but then the passive-aggressive comments started, little digs about how some people aren't committed enough or might not be up for the challenge. It didn't take long to realize these were directed at me. One day, I ran into Mia after work, and when she asked how things were going, I made the mistake of telling her how much I regretted not taking the promotion. She gave me that sympathetic look but added something I didn't expect, that she was honestly relieved I hadn't accepted it. She said she missed me, missed us, and that this way, we'd have more time together, time to plan our future. I wanted to feel reassured by her words, but instead, I just felt like I was trapped between two walls that were slowly closing in, with the pressure from work on one side and Mia's expectations on the other. Then came the company-wide announcement of the new promotion candidate, Mark. I couldn't stand him, but he was technically competent, the kind of guy who did just enough to avoid trouble and somehow always ended up looking good to management. He'd only been with the company for 2 years, compared to my 5, but somehow he'd slid right into the position. The worst part was, he wasn't shy about rubbing it in, always dropping hints about his bright future and the vision he had for our team. I wanted to punch him, but I didn't. I just kept my head down, hoping to get through the awkwardness and move on. But with each passing day, the resentment ate at me, festering like a wound that wouldn't heal. And I began questioning everything, from my decision to Mia's support to whether I even wanted to be at this company anymore. One evening, after Mark had once again undermined me in front of the team, I got home, looked at myself in the mirror, and realized something: I was losing myself. The person staring back at me looked defeated, not like the ambitious, determined guy I used to be. And it was terrifying because I couldn't tell if that was from my own choice or if the environment around me was doing this to me. Things hit a breaking point at the next quarterly review. My performance scores, which had always been top tier, were suddenly below average. My boss, who usually praised my work, barely looked me in the eye as he went through my review, pointing out every minor flaw and emphasizing that I'd lost my edge. By then, it was clear. My career here was effectively over unless I did something drastic. I tried reaching out to HR, explaining the situation, the subtle retaliation, the snide comments, but they told me there was little they could do without hard evidence. Maybe you should consider a fresh start, they suggested, which was HR code for "we don't care." I remember leaving that meeting feeling like I was in free fall. Mia was supportive, but even she couldn't understand the full extent of it, the frustration, the shame. It felt like my life was unraveling. My job, my stability, my sense of self, it was all slipping through my fingers because of one decision. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I found out Mia had been planning a wedding date behind my back, even choosing a venue. She'd decided that since I was no longer on the promotion track, I'd have more time for us. She meant well, but it felt like a slap in the face. She didn't understand that my career wasn't just a job, it was a part of who I was, a part she was casually asking me to abandon for her vision of our future. That night, we had a massive fight. I told her everything, from the retaliation at work to how I felt like a stranger in my own life. She cried, saying she didn't know things were that bad, but the damage was done. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd let her, my job, and myself down. I'd let everyone control my life, and now I was stuck in a purgatory of my own making. Desperate to regain some control, I went to my boss and told him I was ready to step up, that I wanted another chance at the promotion. He looked at me with this smug smile, like he'd known I'd come crawling back. He told me they'd already moved on, that the company was looking for people fully committed to their role. In that moment, I realized he'd never intended to give me a second chance. I was just another pawn to him, a stepping stone for Mark, a warning to others about what happens when you don't fall in line. Feeling humiliated, I walked out of his office, and for the first time in my career, I didn't feel any loyalty to the company I'd sacrificed so much for. I realized I'd been clinging to an illusion, to a sense of loyalty that was never reciprocated. A week later, I handed in my resignation. The company barely reacted, and that hurt almost as much as everything else. I left without a plan, without even knowing what I wanted, just with the overwhelming need to escape. At first, I thought leaving would make me feel liberated, but instead, it felt like free falling. Job offers weren't rolling in like I'd expected. Mia and I drifted further apart, and the guilt of everything weighed on me. It was only after months of soul-searching that I found a small startup willing to take a chance on me. It wasn't glamorous, the pay was modest, and the hours were long, but for the first time in years, I felt a spark again. I had the freedom to make decisions, to learn from my mistakes, and rebuild myself on my own terms. Looking back, turning down that promotion had been the beginning of a painful journey that shattered my illusions but ultimately gave me the clarity I needed. I lost a lot: friends, stability, even my relationship with Mia, but I gained something far more valuable: the strength to start over and the wisdom to never let myself be boxed in again. If I could give advice to anyone reading this, it'd be this: sometimes, what feels like a wrong decision is just life pushing you toward the right path, no matter how painful the journey may be. The time I made a mistake and learned from it starts with me reflecting on a regret, one I've carried for years, but I've never shared it because it sounds insane, like something out of a horror film. But I feel compelled to get it off my chest now, especially since Halloween is around the corner, and I know I can't keep it bottled up any longer. It all started about 5 years ago when I was an anxious sophomore in college, dealing with the usual pressures of exams, relationships, and a desperate need to fit in. I wasn't exactly popular, but there was this one social event that seemed promising, a mysterious gathering in the woods that people whispered about. Imagine a bonfire in a secluded part of the forest, candles in paper bags outlining pathways, and flickering lights reflected off the leaves. It was supposed to be a night of revelations and connections, but deep down, I was terrified of what might actually happen. Should I take that leap and step into the unknown? Nonetheless, curiosity got the better of me, and I found myself following a group of friends to the woods that fateful Friday night. The air was electric, charged with the thrill of untold secrets and laughter echoing around us. As we arrived, I was hit by the smell of smoke and the warmth of the crackling fire. People were engaged in deep conversations, and an unspoken bond pulsed through the night. I was told by my friend Sarah to look out for something called the offering. Apparently, it was some bizarre tradition where attendees would write their biggest fears on pieces of paper and toss them into a fire to, supposedly, cleanse themselves. Entering into the circle, I hesitated, mind racing with my own fears. I had issues, battles with anxiety, overwhelming pressure to succeed, and failing friendships. But I pushed the voice of doubt out of my head and found a scrap of paper in my pocket, scribbling my deepest fear with shaky hands. I tossed the paper into the fire as instructed, watching it curl and ignite, feeling an odd sense of relief wash over me, as if maybe releasing it would set me free. It felt comforting yet oddly unsettling. The night continued, spirits were high, and I met some cool people. A guy named Jake had a whole aura around him, charismatic and a bit mysterious, easily the kind of person who'd be the protagonist in one of those teen dramas. We chatted, laughed, and felt this undeniable chemistry. We even danced, albeit awkwardly, under the moonlight, and everything felt perfect for a moment. Things took a turn, though, when I stumbled upon a makeshift altar at the edge of the bonfire area. Candles flickered ominously amidst strange symbols sprawled across a piece of worn-down wood. In admission, my curiosity got the better of me again, and I approached it, noticing a tiny box nestled between 2 candles. Unmarked and old, it almost felt like it was calling out to me. In my impulsive nature, I reached for it, ignoring the whispered warnings of my friends. Laughter faded into the background as I opened the box and found a small mirror inside. The moment I looked at my reflection, everything around me shifted, the fire flickered out, shadows danced, and suddenly I wasn't just seeing my own reflection. I swear something stared back at me, an echo of darker me, someone with a twisted smirk, eyes glimmering with malice. Shock and fear took hold of me as I stumbled back, and in my panic, I knocked over one of the candles. It fell, and the flames licked dangerously close to the makeshift altar. People screamed and rushed to grab buckets of water to douse the flames while I held up the mirror, paralyzed by both fear and confusion. From that point on, everything spiraled. I could feel heat rising, and foreboding thoughts chased me like ghosts. It was as if something I had unleashed stirred beneath the surface. I hesitated too long, and when I finally let go of the mirror and tossed it aside, dark tendrils emerged from the shadows surrounding me. It's hard to describe, they twisted in unnatural ways, snatching poor Sarah, who had come to check on me. I could hear her scream, and it echoed in my head long after. The flames roared back to life as chaos ensued, and everyone rushed to escape the remnants of something unholy we had awakened. I stumbled back toward the bonfire, caught between horror and regret. The night ended with our group scattered, and I finally recalled one of those elder warnings about the woods, rumors of spirits, of those who had come too close and stayed too long. They became part of the forest, forever lost. I knew I had made a grave mistake. In the aftermath, I couldn't shake the feeling of accountability. My reckless curiosity led to something darker. The guilt consumed me, like a parasite burrowing deeper with each passing day. I never spoke to my friends again, convinced they'd blame me for what happened. The whispers and stares from classmates made it worse. I became a ghost in the halls of my own college, burdened with fear and a heavy conscience. To this day, I struggle to forgive myself. Months felt like years, and then one night, I decided to face my fears. I returned to the forest, the place where it all began, alone. It was eerie, that same unmistakable energy thrumming through the air. But at the heart of it, maybe I hoped to find some semblance of closure. I brought a new paper and a pen, and I found my way back to that spot. The bonfire was long gone, but the circle was faintly etched into the ground, as if the past was still lingering there. I shot my fears out into the darkness once more, knowing full well that this time, they wouldn't consume me. I learned that mistake makes us human, but the aftermath can either strengthen us or break us. And as I stood there, I felt a flicker of hope. As crazy as it sounds, I think I even heard a faint whisper of forgiveness trailing off with the wind. So if you find yourself at a gathering that tempts the unknown, remember this: curiosity can unlock doors better left shut. You can learn from your mistakes, but some shadows might haunt you forever. Whatever choices you make, carry your fears with openness, for they are but a reflection. You'll find strength if you dare face what lies beneath. Please, don't make the mistakes I did. Let my tale serve as a warning, a reminder to tread carefully in realms where darkness lurks and curiosity can ignite something you may never recover from. Why I refused to help a friend in need, a controversial choice. A few months ago, I was faced with a decision that's haunted me ever since, a choice that still makes my heart race every time I think about it. It was one of those situations where everything inside me was screaming that something was wrong, yet everyone around me insisted I should just go along with it. My friend, Alex, had reached out to me after months of no contact. We'd been close once, best friends even, but he had drifted into a different world, one I couldn't quite reach. His life had spiraled out of control, and he'd become increasingly unpredictable, shutting out everyone who tried to help him. I hadn't heard from him in nearly a year, until late one night, my phone lit up with his name, an unexpected message out of the blue. "I need your help," it read, a simple request with no explanation. My first instinct was to brush it off, thinking he was probably up to something reckless, maybe a new scheme that wouldn't end well. But a sense of unease crept in, a feeling I couldn't shake, and despite everything, I found myself messaging him back, asking what was going on. His reply was vague and cryptic, saying he was in trouble, that he couldn't explain everything over text, but he needed me to come to a remote part of town, immediately, no questions asked. I could practically feel the desperation in his words, but something didn't feel right. I asked him where he was, who he was with, and if he was in danger, but his replies were short and evasive. He kept repeating that he couldn't explain over the phone, that it was too risky, but that he really needed me. He was practically begging. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him, asking for an address, but that's when things took a turn. He told me not to tell anyone, to come alone, and to make sure I wasn't followed. It all sounded like some low-budget thriller, and the more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed. Why would he be so secretive? Why couldn't he just meet me somewhere public if he needed help? I tried calling him, but each time, he'd decline, only to text me moments later with the same plea for help. At that point, alarm bells were going off in my head. The area he wanted me to come to wasn't exactly known for being safe, especially late at night. It was a rundown part of town, the kind of place where things went unnoticed and people turned a blind eye. I texted him back, telling him I'd only come if he could give me some kind of explanation, something to make sense of the whole thing. His response was chilling: "Just trust me. I don't have anyone else. Please." The words hit me hard, bringing up memories of all the times we'd been there for each other. Part of me felt like I owed him this, like I couldn't turn my back on him. But the fear gnawed at me, a quiet, insistent dread that warned me to stay away. I confided in a mutual friend, hoping for some guidance, but he was just as baffled. He hadn't spoken to Alex in ages either and agreed that the situation seemed sketchy. "If he can't even tell you what's going on, maybe it's better to stay out of it," he said, but I could tell he was conflicted too. We both knew how deep Alex's troubles ran, how he had a way of dragging people down with him. The longer I hesitated, the more messages came pouring in, each one more frantic than the last. "Please, I'm begging you. Don't leave me hanging. I'm out of options. But every time I typed out a response, I found myself deleting it, unable to shake the feeling that this wasn't just about helping a friend. I felt like I was being drawn into something far darker, something that wouldn't end well for either of us. Eventually, I decided I couldn't go, that whatever trouble he was in, it was beyond what I could handle alone. I told him that he should go to the police if he was in real danger, but his response was angry, almost venomous, as if my refusal was a betrayal. "You think I'd ask the cops for help? You really don't get it, do you?" He accused me of abandoning him, of turning my back when he needed me most. The messages became less like pleas and more like accusations, laced with bitterness and blame. I turned off my phone that night, lying awake in bed, guilt twisting my stomach. The next morning, I learned that he'd been involved in a break-in gone wrong. The news reported that 2 men had been caught on a security camera near a warehouse, both fleeing the scene after an altercation with the guards. Alex's face was there, grainy but recognizable, his expression tense and desperate. They hadn't been caught, and his whereabouts were still unknown. A wave of relief mixed with horror washed over me. If I'd gone, would I have been dragged into that mess? Or worse, would I have been caught up in something even darker? I spent the next few days in a haze of guilt and confusion, torn between regret for abandoning him and a haunting certainty that I'd made the right choice. People in our circle found out, and the backlash was swift. Some said I should have done more, that real friends don't turn their backs. Others whispered that Alex had always been trouble, that it was only a matter of time before he crossed the line. I stopped trying to defend myself, stopped trying to explain the gut feeling I'd had, the dread that told me something was very, very wrong. Weeks went by, and I hadn't heard from him again, though the memory of that night lingered, a constant shadow in the back of my mind. I found myself scanning news reports, always half expecting to see his name again, wondering if he was still out there, angry and betrayed. One night, I received another message from an unknown number. It was Alex, and his words were cold and accusing. "You left me to rot," he wrote. "I'll never forget it." I didn't reply, but the guilt gnawed at me all over again, his words echoing in my mind. Sometimes, I wonder if I made a mistake, if I let fear win over friendship, but then I remember the dread I felt, that gut instinct telling me to stay away. Even now, I'm torn between feeling like I abandoned a friend in need and the overwhelming sense that I avoided something terrible. It's a decision that haunts me, a choice I'll never forget, and one I'm still not sure I'd make any differently if I had the chance. The day I found a lost wallet, what happened next? I never thought finding a lost wallet would lead me to something so strange, so eerie, so utterly bizarre. It was just an ordinary Tuesday morning when it happened. I was walking down the street on my way to work, lost in thought, barely paying attention to my surroundings, when something on the sidewalk caught my eye. It wasn't much, just a small, leather wallet lying half open in the gutter. Most people would have walked right by it, probably assuming it belonged to someone else or was just another lost item with no real significance. But something about it seemed different. I don't know what drew me to it, maybe it was the odd way it was positioned or the fact that there was something inside it that caught the light in a strange way. I knelt down and picked it up, and for a moment, everything seemed still. It was a simple black leather wallet, the kind that could belong to anyone. There were no obvious signs of wear or damage, so it didn't look like it had been there long. I flipped it open, expecting to find a few bills or some loose change. But instead, I found something that made my heart skip a beat, several old, faded photos. The kind of photos you'd find in a time capsule, or tucked away in an attic for decades. They looked ancient, yellowed with age, yet the images were strangely clear. One photo was of a woman, probably in her early 20s, standing in front of a house I didn't recognize. The other was of a group of people gathered around a table at a party, but their faces were blurred, like the photo had been taken in a hurry. The third photo was the strangest, a picture of what appeared to be a child, maybe 10 years old, with dark eyes staring directly into the camera. But there was something about the child's face that felt off, as if it wasn't quite right. I couldn't explain it. It wasn't a bad picture, there was no obvious flaw in it, but the child's expression, the way their eyes were so intense, it sent a chill down my spine. I didn't understand it. Why would someone keep these photos in their wallet? Who were these people? And why were they hidden away in a place like this? My curiosity got the better of me, and I started digging further into the wallet. Inside, there was a small slip of paper with a name and an address. The handwriting was messy, almost hurried, but I could still make out the words, "The old house on Maple Street, 3 p.m. Come alone." My mind raced. What did this mean? Was this some sort of prank? I thought about throwing the wallet back into the gutter and walking away, but something made me hesitate. I had this gut feeling that I couldn't ignore, like I had just stumbled onto something important, something that I was meant to find. But then again, I was no fool. I knew better than to get involved in something that felt off. I was just an ordinary person going about my day, and this could be nothing more than a coincidence. But that nagging feeling wouldn't go away. I kept the wallet in my hand as I walked the rest of the way to work, barely able to focus on anything. The images in the wallet played in my mind over and over again, especially the child's face. Who were they? Why did they look so familiar? I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd seen those eyes before, though I couldn't place where or when. By the time I got to work, I had made up my mind. I wasn't going to let it go. I had to know more about this wallet, the people in the photos, and what that cryptic message meant. After a quick lunch, I found myself standing in front of the house on Maple Street. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like I was being pulled there, like I had no other choice but to follow the instructions on that slip of paper. The house was old, run down, and clearly abandoned. It had a kind of unsettling stillness to it, the kind of place that feels like it holds secrets, just waiting for someone to uncover them. I stood in front of the gate for a long time, just staring at the house, wondering if I was making a huge mistake. But curiosity had already taken over, and I found myself walking up the cracked path leading to the front door. I hesitated for a moment before knocking. There was no response. I knocked again, a little harder this time. Still nothing. I almost turned to leave when I heard it, a faint sound from behind the door. It was the faintest whisper, like someone was calling my name. I froze. My heart raced, and I couldn't tell if I was scared or excited. My hand shook as I turned the doorknob. The door creaked open, revealing a dark hallway with peeling wallpaper and dusty furniture. It looked like the house hadn't been touched in years. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The air smelled musty, stale, as if no one had breathed in it for a long time. I looked around, trying to make sense of it all. Everything in the house was in disarray, as if someone had left in a hurry and never returned. I felt an odd sense of dread creeping up my spine. It wasn't just the house that felt off, it was something in the air, something that made my skin crawl. As I moved deeper into the house, I heard the sound again. This time, it was louder, clearer, and unmistakable. It was a child's laugh. It echoed through the walls, a high-pitched, eerie giggle that sent a chill through my bones. I wanted to turn around, run out of the house, but my feet were rooted to the spot. Something kept me there, something drawing me further in. I followed the sound of the laugh, which seemed to come from the upstairs. Slowly, cautiously, I climbed the creaky stairs, my heart pounding with every step. When I reached the top, I saw a door slightly ajar, a dim light spilling out from the crack. The child's laugh was louder now, almost deafening. I didn't know what I expected to find when I opened the door, but it wasn't what I saw. Inside, there was nothing but a small, dusty room filled with old toys and broken furniture. In the center of the room, sitting on the floor, was a figure. A child. The same child from the photo. But they weren't like any child I'd ever seen. Their skin was pale, their eyes dark and hollow. Their gaze locked onto mine, unblinking, as if they had been waiting for me. I stood there, frozen, unable to move. The child smiled at me, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was wide, unsettling, almost too wide for their face. The giggle I'd been hearing earlier echoed in the room, but now it was louder, as if it was coming from all around me. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't obey. The child's smile grew even wider, their eyes widening to an unnatural size, and I felt the air grow heavier, the room closing in around me. "You shouldn't have come here," the child whispered in a voice that didn't belong to someone so young. "Now, it's too late." Suddenly, the room grew cold, the temperature dropping so fast that I could see my breath in the air. I staggered backward, my heart racing in my chest. The last thing I remember was the child's eyes following me as I turned and ran, stumbling down the stairs, the giggles echoing behind me like a haunting melody. I don't know how I made it out of that house. I don't know why I was drawn there in the first place. But I haven't been able to shake the feeling that I'm being watched ever since. The wallet is gone now, no trace of it anywhere, but the memories linger, haunting me. And every time I close my eyes, I see that child's smile. I know what I found that day was no accident. That wallet wasn't lost. It was waiting for me. An unexpected reunion with my first love, the drama. An unexpected reunion with my first love, the drama. It started as a regular weekend, or at least I thought it would be, with plans to attend a friend's engagement party at a cozy little venue on the outskirts of town. I was excited, dressed in my best, and ready to celebrate. Little did I know, I was about to come face to face with someone I'd once thought I'd spend my entire life with, my first love. I hadn't seen him in years, and honestly, I thought I'd buried that chapter of my life deep enough that it would never resurface. But there he was, standing across the room, looking as if time had barely touched him. He was talking to someone, laughing in that way I'd remembered all too well, the way that used to make my heart race. For a second, I felt like a teenager again, overcome with a wave of nostalgia, mixed with that pit in your stomach kind of feeling that I hadn't experienced in ages. I wanted to look away, to pretend I hadn't seen him, but somehow, I couldn't. Then, as if sensing my gaze, he looked right at me. Our eyes met, and in that split second, the years seemed to melt away, replaced by the raw memory of everything we'd been, and all we hadn't been. He made his way over, and with each step, my heart raced faster. I could barely manage to steady myself as he smiled and said, "Hey, it's been a while, hasn't it?" My mind raced through everything I wanted to say, the questions I'd had for years, the things left unsaid. But all that came out was, "Yeah, it really has." We fell into easy conversation, which surprised me. Somehow, it felt like no time had passed at all. We reminisced about our shared memories, the ridiculous things we'd done as young, foolish kids in love, and there was a part of me that wondered if maybe, just maybe, we could start over. That's when the door opened, and she walked in. She was beautiful, elegant, and confident, the kind of woman who radiated poise and style, the type I'd always felt I could never be. She walked right over to us and slid her arm around his waist, giving me a quick, appraising look before flashing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hi, I'm Sarah," she said, extending a hand. He looked a little uneasy, as if he hadn't expected her to show up just yet, but he quickly masked it with a smile of his own. "This is my fiancé," he said, his words stabbing through me like a knife. Fiancé. The word hung heavy in the air, filling the space between us with a thick, awkward tension. I forced a smile, trying to hide the hurt that was clawing its way to the surface. He had moved on, and clearly, he was serious about this woman, this stranger who now stood beside him, claiming the future we'd once dreamed of sharing. It was a strange feeling, to see the life I'd imagined with him in someone else's hands. I could tell Sarah was trying to gauge me, her eyes flicking back and forth between us, perhaps sensing the history that was silently screaming between us. She didn't let go of him, holding on to him a little tighter, as if staking her claim. I excused myself, pretending I needed to grab a drink, hoping to escape before my emotions betrayed me. As I stood at the bar, clutching my drink, trying to steady my breathing, I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was him again, and the look in his eyes told me he'd followed me to talk. "I didn't know you'd be here tonight," he said softly, as if that would somehow soften the blow of seeing him with someone else. "Neither did I replied, not meeting his gaze. "But I guess life has a funny way of throwing curveballs," he sighed, and for a moment, he looked like he wanted to say something more, something deeper, but instead, he just apologized. He apologized for everything, how things ended, how he handled it, how he moved on too fast. He admitted that he'd thought about reaching out 1,000 times but never did, fearing it would stir up old wounds. The sincerity in his voice made it worse because part of me wanted to forgive him, to let it go, but the other part of me was still hurt, still carrying the weight of what we'd lost. Before I could respond, Sarah appeared beside us, her gaze sharp, clearly not pleased with how close we were standing. "Is everything okay here?" she asked, her voice polite but laced with an undercurrent of suspicion. I nodded quickly, eager to escape the tension. I could see that she was uncomfortable, and honestly, so was I. I didn't want to be the reason for any strain between them, didn't want to be a shadow from the past creeping into his new life. I excused myself again, but this time, he didn't follow. As the evening went on, I found myself constantly aware of them, stealing glances when I thought no one was watching. And each time I saw them together, laughing, whispering, holding hands, a part of me ached with the realization that he had moved on, and I hadn't. I'd been holding on to a ghost, a memory, while he'd built a future with someone else. Toward the end of the night, just as I was about to leave, he came up to me one last time. "I just wanted to say goodbye," he said, his tone soft, almost regretful. I managed a small smile, knowing this was truly the end. "Goodbye," I replied, feeling a strange mix of closure and lingering sadness. As I walked away, I couldn't help but wonder what could have been, but I also realized that maybe this was the universe's way of finally setting me free. I left the party with a heavy heart, but also with a sense of clarity. It hurt, yes, but I knew it was time to let go, to move on, and to find happiness in the life I had, rather than the life I'd once dreamed of with him. The past would always be a part of me, but it no longer had to define me. I never thought I would find myself in a situation that seemed like it was ripped straight out of a horror movie, and yet here I am, typing this out in a darkened room, my only source of light flickering from my phone screen as if the universe is mocking me. This all started about 6 months ago when I moved into a new apartment in a pretty old building. It was a classic fixer-upper, full of creaks, strange noises, and a timeless charm that could easily be overshadowed by its unsettling ambience. You know, the kind of place where you feel like there's always someone watching you, even when you're alone. I always considered myself a private person, someone who kept their feelings and fears tucked away deep inside, only allowing the carefully curated aspects of my life to see the light of day. But the moment I discovered the power of vulnerability changed everything. It was a dreary Friday evening, and I was wrapped up in my usual routine of binge-watching way too many true crime documentaries. I had my takeout on the table beside me, comfortable in my isolation after an exhausting week. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through my apartment, cutting through the hum of the TV. My heart raced as I turned the volume down. The sound came from the old storage closet at the end of the hall. I live alone, and the thought of exploring the creepy closet in an unfamiliar place sent shivers down my spine. I took a deep breath and told myself it was probably nothing. Just my imagination getting the best of me. Curiosity gnawed at me, however, and I eventually found myself standing in front of the door, the wood slightly warped from age. I grasped the handle, half expecting something to leap out at me. To my surprise, it opened easily, revealing a dark, dusty interior filled with a hodgepodge of forgotten furniture and boxes piled high. The shadows inside seemed to stretch and twist, and I shuddered. As I stepped inside, a chill swept over me, goosebumps breaking out on my skin. I fumbled for the light switch and flicked it on, illuminating the chaos within. That's when I saw her, a figure huddled in the corner, shrouded in shadows. I froze, feeling the earlier rush of adrenaline transform into a cold, paralyzing fear. The figure lifted her head slowly, and I saw her face, pale, gaunt, and tired. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, dark circles framing them like bruises. "Help me," she whispered, her voice cracking. My gut twisted. A voice in my head screamed to run, but I felt something, an inexplicable urge to reach out to her. "Who are you?" I stammered, instinctively taking a step back, as if distancing myself could protect me from whatever haunting sorrow cloaked her. I'm lost," she replied, her voice barely audible, weaving through the stillness of the closet like the faintest wind. "Please. I need to feel again." I blinked, confusion swirling in my thoughts. What did that even mean? But as I looked into her eyes, I realized that this wasn't just a manifestation of despair. There was something palpable, almost magnetic, drawing me closer to her pain. In that moment, something inside me cracked open, a floodgate of vulnerability pouring into the space between us. The urge to flee dissipated, replaced with a willingness to understand, an overwhelming desire to share my own burden. I stepped closer, the weight of my own emotional armor feeling heavier than ever. "I know what it's like to feel lost," I murmured, and to my surprise, the connection between us began to intensify. I'm scared. Of so many things. I don't always know how to deal with it." She nodded slowly, as if every word I spoke resonated with her. "Then you understand," she said softly. "That fear. It wraps around you like a tight noose. The darkness feels safe, but in that safety, you forget how to truly live." Those words pierced me, each syllable reverberating in my chest. I was holding on to my fear like a lifeline, convinced that if I let go, I would drown in the chaos of raw emotion. With each passing second, I found myself stripping away my fears like layers of clothing, revealing the raw flesh of my insecurities beneath. It's hard for me, sharing myself with anyone, I admitted, my voice trembling. What if I get hurt? What if they reject me? She smiled gently, the faintest glimmer of understanding shining through her haunted expression. Vulnerability is strength, she said, not a weakness. When you allow yourself to be seen, to be known, you invite connection. You invite healing. Slowly, it dawned on me that she wasn't just a figment of my imagination or a ghost haunting my closet, she was a reflection of all the parts of myself I had neglected. In that dusty, dimly lit closet, surrounded by lost belongings and sorrow, something shifted within me. I understood then that vulnerability didn't signify defeat, it was the first step toward embracing everything I truly was. I finally saw the truth in her face, we were both lost souls, yearning for solace. Gathering my courage, I reached out, brushing my fingertips against her hand, a simple, fleeting gesture. Our connection sparked a warmth that spread through the darkness, dispelling the cold chill fear had wrapped around me for so long. In that instant, I understood the power of vulnerability. No longer was it a monster hiding in the shadows, it was the light illuminating the path toward healing. We sat there together, sharing our fears and dreams, peeling back the layers we had hidden away for far too long. Time lost all meaning, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged, both to her and to myself. Hours passed before I reluctantly pulled away, knowing I couldn't remain in the closet forever. I returned to the familiar glow of my TV, but something felt different. The heaviness in my chest had lifted. I was lighter, freer. I began sharing my journey with the world around me, friends, co-workers, even online communities. I discovered that each time I spoke my truth, I not only released my fears but also invited others to do the same. I realized there was power in vulnerability because, in opening ourselves up, we create spaces for others to find their voices, too. Today, as I type this out, I'm no longer that terrified person living in isolation. I've found strength in my vulnerability, and I promise you it won't lead you to darkness, but instead, it'll guide you toward a connection that transcends the mundane. So, if you ever find yourself feeling lost or alone, remember, vulnerability is a superpower. Embrace it, wield it, and you might just uncover a world waiting to welcome you.
Every night for the past month, after I would tuck my 7-year-old son, Ethan, into bed, he would excitedly pull out his favorite bedtime storybook and eagerly flip through the pages, but lately, he's taken to gasping and giggling at the stories contained within. At first, I thought it was just a new level of imagination sparking his bedtime routine, the way kids do. It was a simple, unassuming book, a compilation of classic tales, and I had picked it up from a garage sale to stimulate his love for reading, but when I started noticing that some of the stories were fresh, new, I felt pricking concern. The old fairy tales he adored would suddenly shift into vivid, strange accounts filled with bizarre characters, like a three-headed dragon that spun wheels of candy, or a princess who could control the weather with a flick of her wrist, and honestly, after the initial intrigue flickered away, I began to dread what I would find every evening. One night, as I sat on the edge of his bed, tired from a day of work and stress, I leaned over to see the latest edition. The tale was unsettling, featuring a character that wore a mask made of shadow and whispered secrets into the ears of sleeping children. As Ethan read it with a delighted demeanor, I felt chills creeping up my spine. I had been too exhausted to read much, but as I flipped through the pages when he wasn't looking, words morphed and new illustrations emerged, depicting grotesque creatures I felt were crafted by someone with a twisted sense of humor. The next night, I decided to put the storybook away, hoping it was just a coincidence that the book had altered itself, but Ethan begged for it, claiming he could almost feel the characters coming to life behind the pages. I relented, thinking I was being overly protective, and after glancing through it again, I noticed that one of the tales was about a dead father who returned at night to apologize for leaving. That night, as I lay in bed beside Ethan, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I felt it build inside me as I did my best to ignore his laughter echoing from the other side of the room where he was reading, all alone to himself suddenly, since we had established a strict lights-out rule. I waited for the uproar of anxiety to swallow me, and when his giggles transformed into soft whispers, unease threaded through my thoughts. I could swear I heard him saying, "Tell me more," before a freezing sensation slithered across my skin. Unable to contain my fear, I slipped out of bed and tiptoed to his room. There he sat, illuminated only by the weak glow of his bedside lamp, The book propped open on his lap as pages fluttered like restless wings, and behind it, shadows loomed and danced eerily against the walls, where painted trees swayed in ways they shouldn't. I was ready to scold him, to tell him stories weren't meant to be told this way, but my breath caught when I noticed something devouring his attention. The open pages bore illustrations of us, of me, of Ethan, staring back at us from within the drawings in a way that felt surreal and raw. It had us sitting at the dinner table, then sleeping in our beds, my heart hammering in my chest as realization struck me. It was recording our lives back to me. I felt bile rise in my throat as I turned each page, seeing snapshots of our mundane moments morphing into grotesque renditions, a scene of me gripping Ethan in a hug but in a twisted nightmare where I appeared to be siphoning his energy away. I felt weight in the air, a heaviness felt deep in my bones, and I suddenly closed the book with a shout while grabbing Ethan, the deep chill that enveloped the room flickering to life, and I knew we had to get rid of this cursed thing, and I burned it in the backyard while Ethan stood back, confused and teary, asking what was wrong. But that night, I couldn't sleep, haunted by visions of the new stories they'd try to tell without their physical form. Shivers rattled through me while I listened to Ethan's soft cries from his room. He was pleading with someone whom I could not see, tears streaming down his cheeks as he whispered, "Why did you take it away?" Under the guise of comfort, I pulled him to me and told him it was just a book, that there are many others, but I watched him spiral deep into despair, his tiny fingers clenching my shirt as if I were keeping him secure against an unseen terror. I wished I could tell him the book was gone, but I feared the darkness it had left lingering behind, that it had stolen a piece of him, and I couldn't understand how something so innocent could turn so menacing, yet the very thought of searching for another tale felt like a betrayal. Still, that dread didn't stop the unease from flooding through his tiny body. The next few nights were a restless series of nightmares, but I could no longer hear the whispers. Something else was now creeping in every moment of the day. The longer I stayed awake, wondering what had transpired, the more I began to see things out of the corners of my eyes, dark, fidgeting shapes lurking in the shadows of our home. Ethan developed an affinity for playing with his imaginary friend named Jack, whose laughter echoed around us at times I wished for silence. He started dressing differently, wearing too many layers even during the warmest days, claiming Jack told him to stay cozy. For what? I had no clue. I dismissed it as the vivid imagination of children, but as more nights went by, a gnawing fear began to tug at my heart. Jack wasn't just imaginary. One night, when the new moon lit the room with an oppressive quiet, I noticed Ethan speaking in hushed tones to a corner in our living room, his voice sweet, but tinged with something darker that sent chills coursing through my veins. "Jack says he's been waiting," my son murmured, a faraway look in his eyes as he gazed into the void. I couldn't keep it bottled up anymore. I had to know what that book had done. I stood, frozen, fear coiling tight around my chest while I approached him. My desperate plea erupted almost involuntarily. "Ethan, who is Jack?" His head snapped toward me, those bright eyes swirling with shadows I couldn't comprehend, and he grinned a grin that didn't feel like my son's. "Jack is my friend, Mama. He's told me all about the stories he shares, and I told him about you," he said in a tone that made my heart race. "He loves your stories, he loves your secrets. Please," I could barely whisper. "You need to get away from him." But it was too late. The distortion in Ethan's voice unnerved me. I barely remembered how I returned to my own room, feeling as if Jack had woven invisible chains around my legs. That night, in the darkness, I tucked Ethan in, pressing my body against that familiar warmth, praying I'd wake up to see my son back in his innocent world, but the dreams morphed into twisted reflections where Jack's face spilled from the shadows, gliding through my dreamscape. Days later, I found Ethan huddled in a corner, hissing as if he were speaking to someone who was clearly there just beyond my vision, and dread settled in my bones, a black fog of despair that I could almost taste. "Jack wants to come see you, Mommy," he said, that airy voice sending tremors through me. From my throat emerged a last pitiful cry that I could have sworn fell flat against an invisible wall of nightmares. The night slipped into twilight, and as the relentless chills enveloped my home, I finally prayed to see Ethan back at the breakfast table, to illustrate something harmless once more, but the sinister laughter echoed in my memory as I remembered the grotesque specter watching from beyond the pages, and I remembered horror wasn't merely ink, it was now anchored in my very life.
I have a story that feels too surreal to be real, but I assure you it is. What happened to me forever changed how I view failure, but it also left a mark on my soul that I cannot unsee. It started like any other night. I was seated at my desk, fidgeting with my pen as I prepared myself to submit my manuscript for a writing contest that had drawn considerable attention. This was it for me. As a struggling writer, I had always feared that my talent could be a mirage, a temporary reflection in a dark pool of self-doubt. The contest was my opportunity to confront that fear head-on, yet I hesitated. My mind twisted like a frayed wire at the mere thought of rejection. Stories of failure flooded my mind, dreams of accolades vanishing as quickly as they appeared, and the laughter of friends who had already published their own work ringing in my ears like a haunting echo. It grew late, and the silence of my apartment became an echo chamber for my anxiety. I reread my manuscript for what felt like the 100th time, searching for errors, flaws, anything that might hint that I wasn't worthy. Just as I was about to close my laptop for the night, an unfamiliar notification chirped on my phone. To my surprise, a message from a childhood friend, someone I hadn't spoken to in years, popped up. "Hey. Long time no see. You remember that time at camp, right? I think I still have that old journal we found." It triggered a wave of nostalgia. I remembered that summer, the smell of pine trees, the warmth of the sun, and two kids sharing secrets beneath the stars. As I dug deeper into those memories, I recalled how we'd written fantastical stories, daring each other to share them aloud around the campfire. But there was one story I had never shared, an original tale of a haunted typewriter that cursed its user to write nothing but their worst fears, inked in fear and ink. That night, moved by the reminder of my younger self and fueled by both nostalgia and absurdity, I decided to type my version of that story. I began typing furiously, words tumbling out more swiftly than I could think, shadows from the past illuminating the dark corners of my mind, where the fear of failure lurked like a predator. The tale unfolded into a tale about a girl named Elise who, unwittingly, inherited an old typewriter shunned by every writer in town. They said it was cursed. It morphed into a vessel for every insecurity and fear, urging its owner to scribble with the weight of dread. With every keystroke, the girl lost herself deeper within the typewriter as it manipulated her mind into crafting twisted tales filled with failure. I became absorbed in the narrative, feeling a strange connection to Elise and the dread of her impending doom as I hammered out the last stanzas. Somehow, that energy expelled some of my own fears, and as the story came to life, I felt liberated. When I finally finished, an odd sense of clarity washed over me, a realization that my darkest fears were merely shrouded in myth, like the typewriter itself. Taking a deep breath, I read my piece aloud, the very words that had echoed in Elise's mind now offering solace instead of suffocation. I felt an unexpected triumph as if I were unveiling a hidden truth about myself to the world. When I clicked submit, I could practically hear 1,000 mini explosions of doubt and anxiety fading into oblivion. I was free. That euphoric feeling lasted precisely 6 hours until I received an email notifying me that my entry had been shortlisted. Panic surged through me. Winning was now a breath away, and the shadow of fear crawled back, twisting like a snake around my heart. I didn't want to fail, I didn't want to be the girl who wrote but never published, who dreams without action. So, I found a way to put the fear to rest. I thought back to Elise and her cursed typewriter, maybe I could confront my fear like she did. I decided to hold an impromptu reading in a local cafe, where any regular could attend. I reached out to a handful of friends, and to my astonishment, they rallied, sharing the event on social media, enticing others to join. I scheduled the reading with just days to prepare. The moment the cafe filled with warm chatter, people laughing and sipping their lattes, my heart began racing. The typewriter's curse had came true, my fears echoed with every heartbeat. But as I stood behind the microphone, I could almost feel Elise's spirit beside me, urging me to speak, to reclaim the control I believed I had lost. So, I did. I opened my mouth and started, and as I read my story, I could see the audience leaning forward, captivated. Their gazes were nothing but warm encouragement, erasing the doubt that threatened to drown me whole. Unbeknownst to me, the cafe owner recorded the reading, and later chose to post snippets online. The clip went viral. The encouragement I received cut through the fog of despair that had reeled me back after the thrill of submitting my work. I had been met with kindness, applause, and the acknowledgement that failure was not the end, but merely a step on my journey. As I left that cafe, the sun was casting its golden light across the city, and I felt changed. I realized that confronting my fear of failure didn't mean avoiding it, it meant accepting it, allowing it to fuel my passion. Failure wasn't a monster lurking in the dark, it was a critical part of my story. So, the next day in a wave of courage, I shared the recording from that reading online. The response was overwhelming. Fellow writers from around the world sent messages of support and encouragement. I even received an invitation to be a guest speaker at a writer's workshop. The comments flooded in, words of gratitude filling my inbox. I became a beacon for others who bore the same burdens. Through embracing that fear, I not only uncovered resilience within myself, but a community that thrived on vulnerability and authenticity. Fast forward a few months, I was invited to a literary festival, sharing stages with authors I'd admired. But there was a small part of me that remained vigilant of the lurking fears that once threatened to bury me. During one of the panels, I spoke about my journey, how I had tapped into a long-buried passion through the shadows of fear and doubt. It was cathartic, and as the audience listened, I felt a connection, a shared experience that transcended my own insecurities. I left the stage, thinking about Elise, the haunted typewriter, and the message I wanted to share: it was okay to fail. Failure doesn't define you, it allows you to rise again. Embracing it is where the magic happens, where art is born, where connections are forged. So, if you're reading this and awake in the struggles of your mind, remember the twist: failure is part of the journey, not something to be feared but an inevitable step towards success. I confronted my fear of failure, and while it still clings like dust, I've learned to dance with it, to turn setbacks into stepping stones on the beautiful, chaotic path of being human. I will continue to write, to share my truth, and to encourage others to excavate their own stories, because the world needs your voice.
I can't shake the feeling that I've become part of a sick, twisted game, and it all started when I found that Polaroid slipped under my door, the picture still glossy, gleaming unnaturally in the pale light of my first-floor apartment. The photo was a snapshot of me, blissfully asleep, my messy hair strewn across my pillow like dark waves, my face blissfully unaware of the horror that had unfolded just inches from my snoozing self. I remember staring at it, stomach twisting, as disbelief morphed into a primal fear that curled around my spine, a dreadful realization that someone had been watching me, someone who knew my habits. I lived alone, with no cats to blame, no prying neighbors peeking through the blinds. The thought that someone had entered uninvited gnawed at my sanity. After the initial shock, I tried to dismiss it. I convinced myself it must be a prank, maybe from the group of college kids who lived upstairs. They'd seen me at the local coffee shop enough times to know it was me. I locked my door tighter than usual and spent the day scrolling through my phone, searching for answers, diving into conspiracy theories of private cameras and sinister stalkers, my heart racing every time I glanced toward the door. That evening, while flipping through my stack of horror novels, I heard footsteps outside, slow and deliberate. My pulse quickened as I tiptoed to the peephole, dread settling in my stomach, and peered through. Nothing. Just the dim, flickering lights of the hallway casting long shadows. I decided my mind was playing tricks on me and tried to shake off the paranoia. Showered, changed into my pajamas, and put a kettle on. Standing in the kitchen, I nearly jumped when I heard a sharp rap against the door, the knock echoing coldly in the silence. I hesitated for a moment, fear and curiosity fighting for dominance until I placed my hand on the doorknob. Glancing through the peephole again, I was met with absolute darkness on the other side, no one in sight. Slowly, I pulled the door open, a heavy creak betraying my nerves, only to find nothing but the emptiness of the landing. Shaking my head, I chalked it up to a trick of the light, closed the door, and locked it again, convincing myself I was being ridiculous. But dread filled my mind that night, tossing and turning until I finally fell into a restless sleep, haunted by dreams where eyes lurked in the dark, where shadows whispered my name. The nights grew longer, and I became a prisoner in my own home, convinced I could hear breathing beyond the thin walls, the racing of my heart a dull drumbeat marking the time until daylight. Each morning I checked for new Polaroids and found none. I wondered if it had all been a figment of my imagination until I opened the door one fateful afternoon after hearing an urgent knock again, to find not just another disturbing photo but a note. The writing was jagged, almost manic, and it sent shivers down my spine as I read the words, "You can't hide from me." My heart sank as I stepped back, fingertips trembling against the door frame, and the rush of cold air sent chills down my arms. Panic set in as I stumbled blindly toward my phone, desperately dialing for help, only to be met with the screeching silence of an empty apartment. I had no one to turn to, no friend nearby to believe me, no partner nearby to comfort me. The reality of my isolation pressed down hard as every sound seemed to amplify, the ticking of the clock echoing in my ears like a warning signal. I barely slept in the following days, just laid in bed staring at the ceiling, watching time crawl, praying desperately that whoever it was would lose interest and simply go away. But there was no reprieve. The photos kept coming, each capturing a more intimate view than the last, me brushing my teeth, me folding laundry, even the moment I broke down in tears when I thought no one was watching. My anxiety morphed into anger, a burning rage toward this invasive phantom. I considered calling the police, but what could I possibly tell them? "Excuse me, officer, someone took pictures of me while I slept?" I could only dream of confronting my tormentor, confronting my fear, and I thought maybe I'd finally be able to breathe again if I found them. I began to devise a plan, to make myself less of a victim, borrowing the techniques I had read about in true crime novels. I set up a makeshift fortress, barricaded my windows with chairs and tables, and armed myself with a kitchen knife. The day I started tracking the photos was the day everything changed. I started documenting the times I'd find the Polaroids and the varying distances from my apartment. I noticed a pattern. The photos came at random intervals, sometimes every few hours, other times days apart, but the closer they got to the final week, the more brazen they became, capturing my window, my dark silhouette outlined against the night. The last photo I received left me shaking. It was a silhouette of someone standing outside my door, and written beneath in blood-red ink were the words, "I see you. Your fear tastes sweet." Each day turned into pure torment. I felt like a ghost trapped in my own home, the walls closing in, pressing against my mind until I felt ready to explode. And yet, one night, I thought I had a breakthrough. A sudden rush of adrenaline coursed through me when the knock I had so dreaded echoed through the silent halls once more, but I was ready this time. I swung the door open without hesitation, knife raised, adrenaline spilling from my veins like fire. Instead of a face, I found a package, a small, nondescript box left at my feet. I knelt and hesitantly picked it up, my skin crawling as I fumbled with the sides. Despite my instinct screaming at me not to open it, I had to know. Inside was nothing but a small Polaroid camera, the same model I'd seen tossed about in my tormentor's pictures, the film still loaded within. There was no note, no indication of who had left it, only a whispering dread that enveloped me. Gripping the camera with clammy hands, I turned it on my own shaking reflection in the glass of my front door, ready to take a shot, wanting to confront this nightmare on my terms. One click was all it took to capture a glimpse of myself. The moment was frozen, the flash bright as my heart raced, yet when the image developed, the horror seized me. Behind me in the reflection stood a figure, unidentifiable yet striking in its ethereal presence, a grin stretching across its shadowed face. My breath caught in my throat as reality blurred. I shoved the camera back into the box, scrambling backward, slipping against the floor. The lights flickered as a memory struck, and I bolted back to the door. The photo had been outside moments ago, the camera was a lure, and it had to be a distraction. Terror dawned upon me as I turned, catching that same glimpse again, the figure impossibly nearer, eyes now glowing with malevolence. I was inches away from unlocking the door and fading into the unknown when the camera flashed once more. In that instant, I felt a hand on my shoulder, burning like ice against my skin, and in the dead silence of my apartment, I screamed, a sound that cracked through the walls, echoing back to me, as though the dark corners of my life had finally started to return the favor. I'm still not sure what happened next. All I remember is that the door burst open, and when the police finally arrived to silence my desperate cries, it was only the quiet of my empty apartment that greeted them. No cameras, no photos, no signs of my tormentor, just me, standing frozen in time, a whirlwind of confusion and horror etched across my face, clutching a camera, trapped in the final picture captured. My reflection bathed in fear, and my story suspended between reality and nightmare.
Sister-in-law tells my kids I'm not their real parent. It was supposed to be a simple family gathering, a chance to reconnect and enjoy each other's company, but it turned into a nightmare I never saw coming. It started with the kids playing happily in the yard while I grilled burgers and my husband set up the patio for our guests. My sister-in-law, Emily, arrived late, as usual, and immediately began making snide comments about the food and decorations. I brushed it off because I wanted to enjoy the day and keep the peace for my children's sake. The day went on, laughter echoing through the backyard, and everything felt normal until dessert time, when the conversation took a dark turn. I had just cut up a big bowl of strawberries when I overheard Emily talking to my kids, Jamie and Sophie. Curiosity piqued, I leaned closer, pretending to busy myself with the dessert table while eavesdropping. You know, you don't have to listen to everything your mom says. She's not really your mom, I heard her say, her voice casual yet filled with a condescending undertone. My heart sank. What do you mean? Jamie asked, confusion etching his young face. Well, she didn't give birth to you, did she? She adopted you, Emily explained, leaning closer to them, and I felt the anger rise in my chest. I couldn't let this continue. My kids were too young to understand this kind of conversation. Emily, what are you doing? I interrupted, stepping in front of her and the kids, my voice shaking with anger. I was just explaining to them some facts about their family, she said, feigning innocence. This is not the time or place for this. They're just kids, I snapped, my heart racing. Jamie's wide eyes were locked on me, and Sophie looked confused, glancing between us. I'm just trying to help them understand where they come from, Emily said with a dismissive wave of her hand. They need to know that their real family is the one that gave birth to them. That is not your place to say, I shot back, trying to maintain my composure. They know they're adopted. We've talked about it. They don't need you to create doubt in their minds. Oh, come on. It's the truth, she insisted, her tone dripping with sarcasm. My kids were standing there, clearly confused, and I felt my heart breaking as I watched them process the words Emily had thrown at them. Mom, am I not your real son? Jamie asked, his voice trembling, and I felt a wave of devastation wash over me. No, sweetheart, you are my son. You are every bit my son. We love you, and that's what makes us a family, I reassured him, kneeling down to their level, but I could see the uncertainty in their eyes. But Aunt Emily said. He started, and I quickly cut him off, turning my full attention to him. Aunt Emily is wrong. Family is about love and care, not just blood. You are my son, and nothing can change that. I felt Emily's smug gaze piercing through me, her smirk infuriating. You're just trying to make yourself feel better, but kids deserve to know the truth, she said, her words laced with judgment. What truth? That you want to undermine everything we've built as a family. I replied, my anger boiling over. If you can't be supportive and respectful of our family dynamics, then I don't want you around my children. Emily crossed her arms defiantly, her expression hardening. Fine. I'll leave, but you're only hurting them by lying to them about their origins. As she stormed away, I felt a mix of relief and anger. I turned back to my kids, wrapping them in my arms. I'm so sorry you had to hear that, I whispered, holding them tightly. Mom, why did she say those things? Sophie asked, tears welling in her eyes. Because some people don't understand that family is about love, not just blood. You are my kids, and that will never change, I assured them, but doubt lingered in the air. After that day, things felt different. My sister-in-law became a ghost at family gatherings, and the silence between us was deafening. I spent countless nights worrying about the impact her words had on Jamie and Sophie. They seemed fine, but I could tell that something had shifted in their perception of our family. Every time they asked about their adoption, I was careful with my words, trying to instill a sense of pride and security while also deflecting the negativity Emily had introduced. As the weeks passed, I realized that my kids were still processing the whole situation. They would occasionally ask me if I was their real mom, and I would reassure them time and again, but the pain of that day lingered. I knew I had to confront Emily again, not just for my sake, but for the well-being of my children. I reached out to her, suggesting we meet for coffee. I wanted to clear the air, but deep down, I was bracing myself for another confrontation. When we sat down, the tension was palpable. I took a deep breath, knowing this had to be addressed. Emily, we need to talk about what happened at the barbecue, I began, my voice steady. Your words hurt my kids, and that's not okay. She rolled her eyes, dismissing my feelings. They needed to know the truth. But it's not your place to decide how they learn about their adoption. I'm their mother, and I will explain things to them in my own time, I said, trying to keep my cool. You can't just throw that information at them like it's nothing. She huffed, crossing her arms defensively. I was only being honest. It's not my fault you can't handle the truth. You're not being honest, you're being cruel. Family is about love, and that's what we've built. You are tearing that down with your words, I replied, feeling my voice shake with emotion. She stared at me, her expression hardening as she processed my words. You think you're better than me just because you adopted them, she spat. That's not what this is about. I shot back. This is about your choice to undermine my authority and my love for them. If you can't respect our family, then I can't have you around them. As the conversation continued, I felt a mix of anger and sadness wash over me. I never wanted to be in this position, but I also couldn't allow Emily to hurt my children any further. I left the coffee shop feeling drained but empowered. I was determined to protect my kids from any further negativity. Over the next few weeks, I continued to reinforce their sense of belonging, encouraging open conversations about their feelings. Mom, do you think Aunt Emily is right? Jamie asked one night as we read together. I paused, searching for the right words. Emily is wrong about many things, and she doesn't understand what family really means. You are my kids, and I love you more than anything. No one can take that away from us. They nodded, but the doubt still lingered in their eyes. I knew this would take time to heal, but I refused to let Emily's comments define our family. I made sure to create a safe space for my children, where they could express their fears and uncertainties. It was challenging, but with each passing day, I saw their confidence grow. Then, one day, Emily showed up at our house unannounced. My heart raced as I opened the door, unsure of what she wanted. Can we talk? She asked, her tone more subdued than usual. I hesitated but eventually nodded, leading her to the living room. I've been thinking a lot about what happened, she started, her eyes darting around the room. And I realized maybe I crossed a line. I wasn't expecting that. What do you mean? I asked, curious but cautious. I didn't mean to hurt your kids, I just thought they should know the truth about their origins, but I see now that I went about it all wrong, she admitted, looking genuinely remorseful. I want to apologize for how I handled it. I felt a flicker of hope. I appreciate that, Emily. It's important for us to communicate openly, especially when it comes to the kids. They deserve to feel safe and loved. She nodded, and for the first time, I felt like we were on the same page. I really do care about them, she said quietly. I just didn't know how to express that. Family is complicated, but the most important thing is love. We can work through this together if you're willing to try, I replied, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. We spent the rest of the afternoon talking, sharing stories about our childhoods and our hopes for our children's futures. As she left, I felt a sense of closure. I knew this wouldn't be the end of our challenges, but I was hopeful we could navigate them as a family. In the following months, I focused on strengthening the bond with my kids and rebuilding trust in their relationship with Emily. We took family trips, participated in activities together, and even had game nights with my sister-in-law. It was a long road, but I was determined to ensure my children knew that love was what made a family. Through all the ups and downs, we emerged stronger, and I felt grateful for the lessons learned. I realized that the love we shared as a family would always triumph over negativity and doubt. In the end, when I learned to appreciate my parents' sacrifices, it was not through some heartwarming moment over a family dinner or a sappy television show. No, it was a dark, desperate time that forced me to confront the weight of their struggles and the extent of their love. I always thought I had a typical middle-class upbringing. I attended school, went to soccer practice, and spent Saturdays lazing around, playing video games while my parents bustled about with their daily routines. They worked hard, but I never really grasped the magnitude of their sacrifices. It was during my sophomore year of college, a time when the world finally started feeling big and overwhelming, that everything changed. I had just finished a particularly rough week filled with exams and an exhausting part-time job, and on that fateful Friday night, I decided to hit a local bar with my friends to blow off steam. That's when I received the call, the kind that throttles your insides like a vice. My mom's voice trembled on the other end, a mixture of fear and sadness rippling through her words. Dad had been in a car accident, they were taking him to the hospital, and I needed to come home. The drive back felt like a fever dream, hours stretching as I replayed memories of my dad, the way he threw me in the air when I was little, the stories he told each night before bed, how he taught me to ride a bike with nothing but patience and that unmistakable grin of his. I arrived at the hospital, heart racing, and I'll spare you the gruesome details, but we didn't know if he was going to make it. It was a blur of sterile rooms and waiting areas filled with anxious faces. I sat, pacing, my fingers digging into my skin, wondering how this could happen to such a good man. The doctors did everything they could, and after an agonizing 24 hours, they finally let us see him, bandaged, bruised, but alive. That night, as I sat in his hospital room, I tried to wrap my head around what had happened. It should have been a simple drive, but it was a reminder of how fragile life is, and I couldn't help but resent the universe a little for putting us in this situation. Days passed, and as he slowly recovered, we talked more. At first, it was about trivial things, and then, somehow, the conversation turned to sacrifices. Dad recounted stories from his own childhood, growing up in a poor neighborhood, working multiple jobs to pay for college, the struggles my grandparents faced as immigrants looking for a better life. Each tale seemed to tether me closer, connecting the dots between his past and the life I had inherited, a life infused with countless unseen sacrifices. I listened, and the weight of it all began to flood over me. I realized that every time he had insisted I should focus on my studies, it wasn't just parental nagging, it was his attempt to ensure that I wouldn't have to face the same struggles he did, that I might find a way to climb higher, beyond their sacrifices. The layers of their love, unpeeled one by one, revealed a depth I had often taken for granted. My parents had worked endless hours, seldom indulging, saving every dime for my education, worrying silently about bills while still managing to put a plate of food on the table and a smile on their faces. I saw their financial struggles in a different light, no longer just a matter of numbers but representative of their unwavering love for me. They fought through their own pain to nurture my growth, encouraging my dreams while silently burying their own disappointments. The more we talked, the more I began to see my own life as a tapestry woven with their sacrifices. A small harrowing incident happened one night, while I was at home caring for my dad during his recovery. Half asleep on the couch beside him, I was awoken by a sudden cough, only to witness him fumbling for his medication that he had clumsily dropped on the floor. I rushed to his aid, but as I kneeled, I caught a glimpse of his weary eyes. It dawned on me, every ache and pain he hid was a product of years spent toiling for our family, yet here he was, determined to show up for me, even in his fragile state. In that moment, it was like a storm broke inside me. I gripped his hand tightly, this time not out of fear but to ground myself in the present, in the recognition of all he had sacrificed. The next weekend, after he was discharged, I returned to campus, but everything felt different. Instead of scrolling through social media or zoning out in classes, I was stirred by an urgency to reach out. I called my mom, thanking her for juggling work, the home, everything so beautifully, often while I was oblivious to how demanding it really was. I promised to come home more, to genuinely listen, to be present. I began volunteering in community service, realizing that there were countless families like mine, whose stories stayed buried beneath layers of daily struggles. I took those journeys home more frequently, sometimes just to sit in the kitchen with my parents as they cooked, savoring every laugh, every moment. We might not have much in terms of material wealth, but I arrived at a realization that our family was richer than most in love and resilience. Eventually, I returned to university, transformed. My grades improved, yes, but more importantly, I was less distracted by the trivialities of college life. I found new purpose in achieving my dreams, not just for myself but also for my parents, to honor the sacrifices they made. When I walked across the stage at graduation, I searched for them in the crowd, and instead of just acknowledging their efforts in a speech, I planned to take them on a trip, a promise I kept. Looking back, the accident was a stark moment that unveiled the complexities of love within sacrifice. A veil had been lifted, allowing me to appreciate everything my parents endured. It wasn't just a wake-up call, it was a rebirth of sorts, a realization that life is not about living for oneself, but about embracing the opportunities in every experience. Now, my parents are my beacon. They remind me that to appreciate truly means to understand the depths from which love arises, and now I live my life not just for myself but for them, always. I share this not just to recount that harrowing time but to inspire anyone who feels distant from their family. Listen, truly listen, you might discover the sacrifices, and the love, that bind you together are far greater than you ever imagined. I wasn't expecting to find anything significant that day. It all started out like a normal Saturday, the kind where you just want to lounge around, maybe watch some movies or play video games. But when I woke up late in the afternoon, I realized I had a laundry basket full of dirty clothes that needed to be taken care of. So, begrudgingly, I hopped in my car and headed to the laundromat down the street. It was the kind of place that looked like it hadn't been renovated since the 90s, with flickering fluorescent lights and oversized machines that wheezed and rattled as they worked. As I loaded my clothes into the washer, I noticed a woman sitting in the corner, hunched over a stack of papers, her brow furrowed in concentration. I'd seen her around. She came in often, always with that same intense look. I judged her silently, thinking, what could be so difficult about doing laundry? But she caught me staring and offered a thin smile, a gesture I quickly returned, albeit awkwardly. When my machine was full, I sat down at the row of seats opposite her, waiting for the cycle to finish. As I scrolled through my phone, I couldn't help but take glances at her. A few minutes later, she suddenly slammed her papers onto the table with a frustrated sigh, and I was jolted from my distraction. I could see now that the papers were filled with sketches and notes, some sort of project that was clearly stressing her out. I felt a twinge of sympathy, so I dared to ask, "Is everything okay?" She looked up at me, surprised, her blue eyes cutting through the dim light of the laundromat. "It's just this presentation for work. I'm an architect, trying to design a community center, but every idea I sketch isn't translating the way I want." I nodded, not really knowing what to say. I had no artistic skills whatsoever and couldn't fathom the level of work that went into something like that. "Why not just take a break?" I suggested half-heartedly, not thinking it would mean much. But her response took me off guard. "If I take a break, it feels like I'm giving up. You know how hard it is to be taken seriously in my field? There's no room for weakness." I started to respond, but instead, I found myself staring at her sketches, the lines flowing but imprecise, the vision blurring before me, much like her expression. At that moment, something clicked in my mind. I had been feeling lost in my own life, stuck in a job I hated, going through the motions without a clear direction. This woman's struggle was like a mirror that reflected my own. I decided to be more open. "I get that pressure. I'm just a graphic designer, but I feel like everything I create never lives up to my expectations either." This moved her, and she leaned forward a little, the tension in her shoulders easing just a fraction. "Really? That's kind of surprising. I mean, artistry is subjective. Isn't it easier to just create because it makes you happy?" I chuckled, almost a scoff. "You'd think, but it's hard when you're constantly comparing yourself to others. Social media is the worst for that. Seeing other designers' perfect work all the time makes you feel inadequate." She smirked. "Welcome to the world of architecture. It's like everyone thinks they're an expert when they see a finished building. They forget that it came from flaws, late nights, and complete breakdowns." We both chuckled at that, as a sense of understanding passed between us. Her humor was infectious, and for the first time that day, I felt like I might not be alone in my feelings of inadequacy. As our conversation continued, she shared how she found herself overthinking everything, how she had taken years to learn to trust her instincts. "It's hard, but I've learned that every setback is a chance to reassess," she said. "Sometimes, the best ideas come from mistakes." I absorbed her words, as they resonated deep within me. I realized then how much I had been holding myself back, how fear of failure had paralyzed my own creativity. Just as I was starting to feel inspired, the washing machine beeped, interrupting our moment. I rushed to transfer my clothes to the dryer while she prepared to leave. Just before she walked out, she paused, looking back at me. "Remember, it's not about perfection. It's about progress. Don't let comparison steal your joy." And with that, she disappeared through the laundromat's door. I stood there, stunned as I felt her words sink deep into my bones. I finished my laundry, feeling lighter somehow, almost renewed. On my drive home, I suddenly had a rush of ideas for my own work, things I had buried under self-doubt. I pulled out my sketchbook and started drafting designs on the side of the road, the urge to create overtaking me. I spent the next few days pouring myself into projects, no longer tethered by the need for validation. It felt liberating. Then, about a week later, I returned to the laundromat, hoping to see her again. I wanted to thank her, share my progress. Everything had changed because of that moment we shared. Yet, when I arrived, the seats were empty, and she was nowhere to be found. I asked the older attendant if she had seen the woman, and with a puzzled frown, he shook his head. "Not around here, kid. I don't remember anyone like that." Confused and disappointed, I left, feeling like I had been chasing a ghost. Weeks passed, and I continued to refine my work, slowly gaining confidence. I even took part in a local art show, where I displayed the work that had been inspired by that chance encounter. The community center project I created took home the prize for innovation, and I felt pride swell inside me. I always wondered about that woman, wondered if she was real or a figment of my imagination. Then one evening, out of the blue, while I was scrolling through social media, I found an article featuring an upcoming community center project. The picture was of her drawings, the very same sketches I had seen that day at the laundromat. The headline read, "Local architect overcomes self-doubt to inspire community designs." I felt my heart race. The article featured her story, detailing her struggles, her journey of failure, but ultimately triumph. I was ecstatic for her success but utterly confused about the nature of our encounter. I read the piece several times, trying to piece everything together, feeling like I was in some parallel universe. After finishing, I thought about how much I needed that conversation, how it had propelled both of us in different ways. It reminded me that life lessons often come when you least expect them, from people you might never see again. I don't know if I'll ever cross paths with her again, but I'm thankful for the moment in that dimly lit laundromat. It was there, surrounded by the mundane, that I encountered the extraordinary truth that failure doesn't define us, it's the courage to keep going that ultimately shapes our path. So, if you ever find yourself feeling lost, remember, inspiration can be found in the most unexpected places. Even if it's a laundromat on a nondescript Saturday afternoon. It was a rainy Thursday when I stumbled across an old, weathered notebook in the back of my closet. I don't remember where it came from, but the moment I opened it, I felt that familiar shiver trail down my spine. The pages, yellowed with time, were filled with notes and entries from someone who had poured their soul onto the paper. The words were messy, frantic, filled with an inexplicable blend of despair and hope. The first entry caught my eye. "I found joy in helping others, but it comes at a cost." I flipped through more pages, each one detailing eerie encounters with people in need, like the time the writer found a homeless man eating scraps from a dumpster and decided to give him his lunch, a gesture that spiraled into something dark and unsettling. The narrative woven through the notebook suggested that every act of kindness led to a profound shift in reality, blurring the line between benevolence and something sinister. I helped him, and in return, I lost a part of myself, he had written. As I continued reading, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this story. The writer described how every time they lent a hand, to a child, a widow, an abandoned pet, something inexplicable happened. They became more detached from their own feelings and experiences, as if helping others drained their essence like the lifeblood of an unsuspecting victim. In a twisted way, it felt exhilarating. I could relate. I had always found solace in helping others, in the idea that my actions could spark joy in someone else's life, but I had never felt the intensity of those encounters as described in the notebook. After hours of reading, my head spun with excitement and dread. I had to try it for myself. I decided to spend a week focusing solely on helping others, giving my time and energy to those in need, believing that perhaps I could find joy just as the writer did. I kicked off my quest that very Friday by volunteering at a local soup kitchen. The faces of people receiving meals were filled with gratitude, and as I slipped sandwiches into their hands, I felt a rush of warmth. I stayed late, cleaning up, chatting with volunteers, and basking in the glow of camaraderie. It felt amazing. The next day, I found myself on a park bench, watching a young woman struggle with her 2 children. Without a second thought, I approached her and offered to help, carrying her bags while she wrangled her kids. She was overwhelmed, nearly in tears, and thanked me profusely. But something uninvited stirred beneath the surface, an almost intoxicating pull, and whatever joy I felt started morphing into a creeping numbness. I brushed it aside, chalking it up to fatigue. Sunday came, and I organized a small donation drive in my neighborhood, gathering clothes and toys for those in need. When I delivered them, the grateful looks of the recipients filled me with pride, but when I got home, an oppressive silence settled over me. The joy I had expected felt hollow, as if I had been suffocated by obligation rather than buoyed by altruism. By the end of the week, I was sleep-deprived and weirdly detached. Each act of kindness seemed to consume more of my essence, leaving me disjointed and restless. I opened the notebook again, scanning for clues about what had gone wrong. There at the end, a chilling entry caught my eye. The writer explained that a price was paid for every good deed, a piece of the self, an energy that would forever be absent. I thought I was helping others, it read, but each act stole my joy and twisted it into something grotesque. I slammed the notebook shut, breathing heavily. No matter how many times I tried to grasp the joy of helping others, I could feel something darker creeping in, a shadow clinging to my thoughts. By the week's end, I was a shell of my former self. I realized that with every person I had tried to uplift, I had unknowingly made a sacrifice, not in possessions or time, but a gradual erosion of my happiness. But despite the dread in my gut, I needed to push through, to defy the impending panic. My last act of kindness was supposed to be the easiest, helping a neighbor who had just lost a family member. I brought flowers and offered to help clean. When I entered her home, the heaviness was palpable. It wasn't just grief that suffocated the air, it was something else, something dark that twisted around my heart. I sat with her on the couch, shuffling through awkward conversations, but the longer we talked, the more I felt myself slipping away. Suddenly, she confessed that her family had been haunted by something sinister, a malevolent force they couldn't shake off. My head spun, and I wanted to laugh it off, to claim it's just a figment of grief, but the way her eyes glimmered with desperation froze the words in my throat. She looked at me as if I were her last hope, and I couldn't turn away. Against my will, empathy surged. I held her hand tightly, insisting I would help her find closure. I was withdrawing from my joy, infusing it into her sadness. I could sense the darkness creeping over me as she cried out her fears. At that moment, laughter erupted from her children, breaking the tension for an instant. But I felt twisted inside. I was giving too much, and the terrible realization gnawed at me. What if this darkness was contagious? The feeling erupted into panic. I yanked my hand back and bolted out of the house, feeling utterly shattered. I collapsed onto my porch, trembling, the notebook in my hands. I could no longer deny it, a song of joy couldn't be danced to if it was laced with such darkness. As I finished realizing the toll my good intentions had taken on me, the rain began to fall again, but this time, instead of cleansing, I felt it smothering. I vowed to never touch that cursed notebook again, or help anyone in such a profound way. But as I write this, I can still hear echoes of my voice crying out for a return to joy, bumping against my ears like a haunting melody stuck on repeat. Then I close my eyes, wishing the next day would bring light instead of the ever-growing despair that shadows me now. I know I sought joy in helping others, but with the notebook beneath my bed, I find myself lost in a darkness I never anticipated, haunted by the choice to lend my hand.
I moved to a small town nestled between dense woods and a craggy mountain range, drawn by the promise of a quiet life where neighbors greet you with warm smiles, but that allure was quickly snuffed out by the one chilling rule: don't look outside after sundown. At first, I laughed it off as a quaint superstition, much like the old wives' tales we used to share on rainy days. But every evening, as the sunset and the vibrant hues of twilight began to fade, I noticed my neighbors slipping into their homes, drawing heavy curtains while casting sidelong glances at the wooded edge of town, their faces pale and drawn. It unnerved me, this collective fear that blanketed the town like a heavy fog. Curiosity gnawed at me, and one night, after hearing the whispered warnings from my neighbor Margie about the watchers and the stories of those who had vanished after glancing out, I felt an inexplicable urge to see what lay beyond the threshold of my door. As the last sliver of light dipped below the horizon, I could hear the distant rustle of leaves and a low hum, almost like chanting, resonating from the woods, a sound that struck me with a primal fear. I resisted for a long moment but ultimately gave in, peeling apart the blinds just enough to peek outside. The world had transformed, cloaked in shadows so thick they seemed tangible, wrapping around the silhouettes of gnarled trees like grasping hands. My heart raced as my gaze was drawn to an unnatural movement at the tree line. A figure, cloaked in darkness, emerged from the underbrush, its gaunt limbs stretching unnaturally as it turned its head toward my window. I gasped and jerked back, my skin prickling with dread, but the thought of never knowing what that thing was propelled me back to the window. I looked again, and my breath caught in my throat. The figure was closer now, impossibly tall, with hollow eyes that glowed a sickly yellow, fixing me in a cold, unyielding stare that seemed to reach deep into my soul. Something inside me wanted to scream, but I found myself paralyzed, aware of the murmurs of voices rising from the depths of the woods, weaving an unholy chorus that seemed to beckon the creature forward. I finally tore my gaze away, backing away from the window, and in that moment I heard a soft tap, like a gentle knock on my door, but I knew it was no mere visitor. It felt like an invitation laced with malevolence. My heart thumped violently in my chest as I glanced at the clock, midnight. I thought of my neighbors, surely they had seen it too, perhaps their fear stemmed from something real. I crept to the front door, fighting against the raw urge to flee, and pressed my ear against the wood to listen. The tapping grew more insistent, morphing into a slow, deliberate pounding that echoed in my mind, and just as I was about to retreat, the sound stopped abruptly. Instead, I heard the faintest whisper, flowing through the keyhole like wicked smoke, "Let us in." Panic surged through me, and I staggered back, my instincts screaming for me to lock this place down, to do anything but invite unknown horrors into my sanctuary. I stumbled back into the dim light of my living room, fumbling for my phone, but my screen flashed no signal, plunging me deeper into isolation as thoughts of escape swirled in my mind like a tempest. Just when I thought the worst had passed, there was a bang at the window, a deafening thud that sent my heart racing anew. I turned, and there it was, the creature, silhouetted against the dim glow of the streetlight, its mouth moving soundlessly as if it were forming a name, my name. But I did what I had vowed not to. Without thinking, I charged toward the window, yanking the curtains aside in sheer defiance. Instead of the expected horror awaiting me, I saw not one but dozens of pairs of eyes staring back, all fixed and expectant. They were all my neighbors, their faces pale and contorted with fear, mouthing the same word over and over, "Run." The chanting resumed, louder now, shaking me to my core, and I spun around to flee but stumbled on the rug, crashing to the floor as the shadows crept closer, dark and overwhelming. Fear locked my muscles, and for a moment, I could do nothing but gaze into the void of the creature's eyes, which felt like endless pits of despair. But as the cacophony reached a chilling crescendo, clarity pierced the fog of my terror. I had all along been an unwilling participant in their nightly ritual, each sunset surrendering another soul to the monstrous woods beyond. My survival instinct ignited, and I bolted toward the door, flinging it open and plunging into the night. The icy air stung my lungs as I sprinted down the street, heart pounding, adrenaline coursing through my veins, with the whispers growing more frantic behind me. I could feel a momentum building, the darkness pulling and tugging at my very being, inviting me to give in, to turn back. The trees loomed closer, the chant swelling into a howl, a promise of unspeakable suffering if I dared to glance over my shoulder. I could hear the heavy footsteps trailing behind me, the shadows merging and twisting into unholy forms just beyond my periphery. Desperation surged as I broke through the tree line, fueled by the primal instinct to escape whatever fate awaited me in this accursed town. I ran and ran, branches scratching at my arms as the moon illuminated the erratic path ahead, until I burst onto a gravel road that bent away from the town and into dark nothingness. But the shrieks that filled the air behind me grew louder, overwhelming my senses. Life somewhere distant was held behind that threshold, and as the echo of that screeching chant haunted my very bones, realization struck. I was free of the town, for now, but would I ever truly escape the memories, the nightmarish calls drawing me back to the shadows? I could feel the dread seeping into my mind though, gnawing at the edges of my sanity, the undeniable truth that after sundown, I would spend the rest of my life trying not to look back.
My boss expects me to work on my wedding day. Should I quit? It all started as a dream job, a position I had worked tirelessly to secure. The thrill of working in a fast-paced marketing agency was intoxicating, and I poured my heart and soul into every project. But as my wedding day approached, everything began to unravel. My fiancé, Jake, and I had spent months planning the perfect ceremony, poring over every detail, and visualizing the day we would finally say I do. I was ecstatic, ready to celebrate the love we had built together. However, just 2 weeks before the big day, I received a chilling email from my boss, Kelly. It was a reminder about an important client meeting scheduled for the same day as my wedding. My stomach dropped. I was hopeful that it was just a misunderstanding, so I replied, politely requesting to reschedule. But when I approached Kelly in person, I was met with a steely gaze. "You're the lead on this project. We can't afford to lose momentum, especially with this client," she said. "You have to be there." I felt the walls closing in. "But it's my wedding day, Kelly. I can't just cancel or push it back. It's important to me and my family." Her expression didn't change. "I understand, but this is a crucial time for our company. You can't let your personal life interfere with your work responsibilities." The weight of her words hung in the air, and I felt a mixture of frustration and helplessness. I had always been committed to my job, often going above and beyond. But this felt different. This was my wedding, a once-in-a-lifetime event, and I couldn't wrap my head around the idea of having to choose between my career and my personal happiness. I went home that night, feeling utterly defeated. I tried to talk to Jake about it, hoping he would support me. But when I explained the situation, his brow furrowed with concern. "This isn't just a job, honey. You love what you do, and I know how hard you've worked for this position. Maybe it's worth considering what Kelly said." I couldn't believe my ears. "You think I should skip my wedding for a client meeting? Jake, this is our day. I've dreamed about it since I was a little girl," he sighed, rubbing his temples. "I'm not saying that. But you don't want to burn bridges either. Can't you find a way to make it work?" I felt torn, the pressure of expectations weighing heavily on my shoulders. I spent the next few days in turmoil, trying to find a solution. I reached out to colleagues for advice, hoping someone would have a suggestion that could help me navigate this mess. But everyone seemed to echo the same sentiment: you can't risk your career over one day. It felt like a betrayal, and I began to question the loyalty of my coworkers. Each day that passed brought more anxiety, and I found myself constantly refreshing my email, waiting for any sign of understanding from Kelly. The day before the wedding, I decided to go in early, hoping to catch Kelly and explain my side one last time. The office was eerily quiet, and I could feel the tension in the air as I approached her office. When I knocked, she looked up from her computer, a mixture of surprise and irritation crossing her face. "What is it, Jenna?" I took a deep breath, trying to keep my composure. "I just wanted to ask if there's any way we can reschedule the meeting. I understand the importance, but it's my wedding day, and I really can't miss it," Kelly sighed, her patience wearing thin. "I've told you before, this is non-negotiable. You need to put your priorities straight. This is a pivotal moment for our company, and I expect you to act accordingly." I felt my heart sink. "I can't believe you're saying this. You're really going to make me choose between my job and my wedding?" She shrugged, completely unfazed. "You've made your choice by being here. Just know that if you're not there, it will reflect poorly on you." I stormed out of her office, a mix of anger and despair swirling inside me. I had been pushed to the limit, and I felt betrayed by a company I had devoted myself to. When I got home, I couldn't hold back the tears. "What am I going to do?" I sobbed, and Jake pulled me into a comforting embrace. "You have to stand up for yourself, Jenna. You can't let them dictate your life." His words ignited a fire within me. I was tired of feeling like a puppet on strings, forced to dance to the whims of someone else's expectations. That night, I made a decision. I didn't want to live with the regret of sacrificing my happiness for a job that wouldn't hesitate to replace me. I drafted my resignation letter, pouring my heart into it. I explained that I loved my job but couldn't compromise my personal life for the sake of a client meeting. I felt a sense of empowerment wash over me as I clicked send. The next morning, I woke up feeling lighter, but also nervous about the repercussions. I still had to face Kelly, and I couldn't shake the anxiety of what would happen next. As I arrived at the office, I steeled myself for the confrontation. Kelly's expression was one of fury as I walked into her office, the resignation email still fresh in her inbox. "You think you can just walk away like this?" she snapped. "You're making a huge mistake." I took a deep breath, trying to maintain my composure. "No, I'm making the right choice for myself. I won't sacrifice my wedding day for a meeting." She leaned forward, her voice low and threatening. "You'll regret this. Do you really think you can find a job that respects your priorities? You're going to be labeled as unreliable." I stood my ground, feeling a sense of clarity. I'd rather be unemployed than work for someone who doesn't value my personal life. I want to live my life on my own terms. Her face reddened in anger, but I turned on my heel and left her office, a sense of finality in my decision echoing in my heart. The moment I stepped outside, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I was free. I spent the next few days finalizing wedding details, soaking in the joy and excitement. On the day of the wedding, as I stood in my gown, surrounded by family and friends, I felt a profound sense of happiness. Jake looked at me with so much love, and in that moment, I knew I had made the right choice. We exchanged vows, pledging our lives to each other, and every worry about work faded into the background. I had taken a stand for myself and chosen love over corporate expectations. In the weeks that followed, I started a new chapter in my career, one that aligned with my values and priorities. I found a job that appreciated my contributions and recognized the importance of work-life balance. Looking back, I realized that sometimes, the hardest choices lead to the most rewarding outcomes. If you're reading this and find yourself in a similar situation, remember, your happiness and personal life should never take a backseat to someone else's expectations. Always prioritize what matters most, and never be afraid to stand up for yourself, even if it means making tough decisions. When I realized I needed to take a step back, it wasn't because I'd had a long day or felt overwhelmed with the demands of life. No, it was much more unsettling than that. It started like any other Tuesday, the sky a slate gray that threatened rain but never delivered. I was at my desk in my home office, buried beneath a mountain of paperwork, my phone buzzing incessantly with updates I didn't have the mental energy to address. I'd been working from home for what felt like an eternity, and in that sea of isolation, my mind started to drift into strange territories. I was dangerously aware of every creak and sigh of my house. It enveloped me like a familiar but suffocating blanket. Around noon, I decided to step outside for fresh air. I'd always wondered why they say fresh air clears the mind. For me, it only amplified the heaviness in my chest. The moment I closed the door behind me, I felt the world outside swallow me. The neighborhood was eerily quiet, but not in a peaceful way. It felt like a vacuum, a disturbance in the fabric of reality. The air smelled stale, and an unsettling breeze whispered strange secrets I wasn't prepared to hear. It was at that moment I noticed a woman standing across the street, her back turned to me. She wore a long, flowing dress that seemed to flow with the wind, an odd choice for the chill that had settled in. I was struck by how she didn't seem to belong to the world around her, and a shiver crept down my spine as I squinted to see her better. She had long, dark hair that cascaded down her back like an inky waterfall, but there was something wrong about it. No wind stirred it, it hung eerily still. My curiosity kicked in, and I felt drawn to her. As I crossed the street to ask if she needed help, something strange happened. The moment I stepped forward, she turned. Her face was pale, almost translucent, her eyes two hollow voids that sent a jolt of fear straight to my core. I froze, my heart racing. She didn't speak, she just stared at me with eyes that held a darkness deeper than anything I had ever encountered. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. Something in her gaze anchored me in place, and I began to feel lost in her eyes, as if they were portals to some abyss I was not ready to confront. After what felt like an eternity, her mouth formed a smile, but it was devoid of warmth. It was the kind of smile that told me she was about to say something horrific, something that would shatter the fragile barrier between my perception of safety and the cold reality of what lurked just out of sight. I felt the ground beneath me shift, and suddenly I was no longer standing in my neighborhood. I was standing in darkness, surrounded by echoes of laughter that seemed to mock me. The weight of the world pressed down so hard on my chest that every breath felt like a struggle. I blinked, and the landscape morphed back into my street, the woman now gone, but the feeling remained. I rushed back indoors, locking the door behind me as though it could keep whatever horror I'd just witnessed at bay. But the sense of dread clung to me, defining the edges of my thoughts like a shadow that wouldn't relent. I tried to shrug it off, convincing myself it was just a trick of the light or a figment of my imagination, a side effect of too many hours spent alone. Yet, each minute that ticked by felt heavier than the last. My phone buzzed again, and with each notification, my heart raced, anticipating the image of her cropping up on my screen, or worse, the knowledge that she followed me inside. I decided I needed a distraction, so I did what I always do in moments like this. I pulled up social media. Scrolling through pictures of friends and familiar faces should have comforted me, but instead, it felt torturous, like I was trapped in a world that no longer belonged to me. Suddenly, I saw her again, in a video shared by a group I was part of. She was in a park, dancing under a full moon, her long hair flowing wildly as if the darkness itself were alive, and keeping her company, but there was a collective unease in the comments below. The people in the video seemed entranced, their faces a mixture of bliss and terror. My stomach dropped as I read various users claiming she was a local urban legend, a spirit of the night who had been haunting their town for decades, luring the unsuspecting into her thrall. I instinctively felt the room start to close in on me, and the walls felt like they were breathing, pulsing with the same sinister energy I felt in that brief encounter. Panic set in, I could feel the walls of my own sanity begin to crumble. I shut my laptop, but the sensation to escape was overpowering. I paced back and forth in my living room, desperately trying to retreat into reason, but my mind traversed deeper still into the darkness that had unearthed itself inside my head. Sleep finally came hours later, but it did not relieve me. I was caught in a nightmare, trapped in a never-ending loop where I was compelled to confront her, again and again, in varied scenarios where she beckoned me closer. Each time, I awoke in a cold sweat, fully aware of what I needed to do. I had to take a step back from everything, the work, the distractions, the incessant noise of social media. I needed to find grounding, to become reacquainted with reality before whatever I had summoned turned into something truly horrifying. I turned everything off, the computer, the phone, the lights, and I sunk into the silence, allowing the real world to embrace me again. I found myself staring at the walls of my home, feeling the weight of their familiar presence, attempting to find solace in their solidity. But instead, I felt an undeniable pull to that emptiness outside, the woman who awaited me. I finally made the choice to confront her, to see if she had answers to questions gnawing at my sanity. Facing my fear seemed like the only way to reclaim myself from this creeping shadow. The decision both terrified and liberated me. I brushed aside my paranoia and stepped outside into the night, heart racing as I approached the spot where I last saw her. The streetlights flickered dimly, and an uneasy quiet settled around me, but I stood firm. I wouldn't let her consume me. After all, I was ready to take charge. The moment I rounded the corner into the park, it felt as if I had crossed into another realm. The atmosphere thickened, pressing in on me like molasses, stirring a terrifying sense of déjà vu. There she was again, the same haunting figure, twirling and weaving through the darkness as if calling to me. This time, though, there was a faint glimmer of resolve within me. I approached her slowly, defiance igniting an unfamiliar fire in my chest. Just as I opened my mouth to speak, I felt the entire universe shift around us. The trees whispered, the sky darkened further, and with a pained expression, she stopped dancing, turning to face me as though I had broken some wicked spell. In that moment, I saw not just the shadow of who she represented but the reflection of every fear I'd been running from. It was a darkness I couldn't ignore anymore. I would no longer allow that fear to consume me. I took a step forward, and immediately the energy shifted. Her hollow eyes seemed to soften, and for the briefest moment, I could see the sadness behind her facade. It was a moment of shared understanding, a recognition of our shared struggle. I didn't need to absorb her darkness, instead, I needed to take a step back, to reclaim my own light. The woman smiled at me for the first time, and with that simple gesture, the heaviness that had haunted me loosened its grip. I turned away from her and into the night, feeling every invisible weight lift as I walked toward the home I had lost touch with. I finally understood, sometimes, taking a step back isn't about retreating, it's about finding your way back to yourself. My neighbor's secret life, I never expected this. My neighbor's secret life, I never expected this. From the moment I moved into the quiet suburb, my neighbor Joe was the last person I thought would ever become a point of intrigue. He was the picture of normality, middle-aged, graying hair, glasses that slipped down his nose, and a meticulously mowed lawn. His house was an immaculate, single-story, cookie-cutter suburban home with the classic white picket fence, and every morning at 7:30 sharp, he'd be out there watering his flowers with that same steady hand and blank expression. Over the months, we exchanged the typical small talk, occasional nods, and awkward neighborly smiles, but nothing beyond that. Joe seemed to live an ordinary, uneventful life, that is, until the night I heard the sounds. It was around midnight when I first noticed it, strange thuds coming from Joe's backyard, followed by what sounded like muffled voices. I told myself it was nothing, probably a raccoon or maybe Joe moving something heavy, but the sounds continued night after night. Curiosity ate at me. On the fifth night, I finally decided to peek through the gap in my curtains, catching a glimpse of Joe under the dim glow of his porch light. He was dragging something large and bulky across his backyard toward the shed. The figure looked human-sized, covered in what seemed like a thick black tarp. My heart pounded as I watched him struggle to get it through the shed door before disappearing inside. I didn't sleep that night, my mind spiraling with possibilities, trying to convince myself it was just an old rug or maybe some broken furniture, but deep down, I felt something was wrong. The next morning, I casually brought up the noise to Joe when I saw him outside, hoping he'd offer some mundane explanation, but he just smiled in that unsettlingly blank way and said, "Must be the wind." I brushed it off, trying to resume life as normal, but things only got stranger. Every night, around midnight, Joe would perform his ritual, dragging something new to the shed, sometimes covered in black tarp, other times in what looked like burlap sacks. I tried to convince myself he was just a quirky guy with weird habits, but then came the incident that pushed me over the edge. One night, unable to sleep, I stood by my bedroom window, watching his movements, when suddenly, his head jerked up. He looked directly at my window, like he knew I was there, even though I'd been standing in the dark. I quickly backed away, my heart racing, but the next morning, I found a handwritten note slipped under my door. Some things are best left unseen. My hands shook as I read it. Was he threatening me? Warning me? I couldn't tell, but it sent a chill down my spine. I tried to avoid Joe after that, but every encounter felt heavier, his casual smiles masking something far more sinister. I considered calling the police, but I had no real evidence, just paranoia and a gut feeling. Then, one evening, I was walking past his house when I noticed something strange about his car. The trunk was slightly ajar, and from the gap, I could see a flash of what looked like dark stained fabric, and a heavy, metallic scent filled the air. I forced myself to keep walking, but every fiber of my being screamed that something was very, very wrong. Days passed, and I found myself obsessively watching his house. The shed became the center of my fixation. Why was he so secretive about it? Why only go there at night? Desperate for answers, I made a plan. Late one night, when the entire street was dark and silent, I snuck into his backyard, my pulse hammering in my ears. I crept toward the shed, trying the handle, but it was locked. Just as I was about to leave, I spotted a small, dusty window on the side. I peered through it, squinting to make out the shapes inside. My heart nearly stopped. The walls were covered in newspaper clippings, all detailing missing persons cases from the surrounding area, some dating back years. Pictures of smiling faces, red strings connecting them, and handwritten notes filled the space. And in the center of the shed was a chair, chains bolted to its arms and legs, stained with something dark. I staggered back, bile rising in my throat, my mind racing. I had to get out of there, to call the police, to do something. But just as I turned to leave, I froze. Joe was standing there, no more than a few feet away, his face illuminated by the dim moonlight. He didn't look surprised. In fact, he looked calm, as if he'd been expecting me all along. Couldn't resist, could you? He said, his voice as cold as ice. I stammered, trying to come up with an excuse, an apology, anything, but the words wouldn't come. He stepped closer, blocking my path to the gate, his eyes never leaving mine. I warned you, he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Panic surged through me as I tried to push past him, but his grip was like iron, his hands cold and unyielding. I don't remember exactly how I broke free, only that I found myself stumbling back to my house, locking every door and window behind me. I stayed up all night, waiting for the knock on the door, for the sound of him breaking in, but it never came. The next day, I went to the police, desperate to report what I'd seen, but without concrete evidence, they were reluctant to believe me. They agreed to do a welfare check, but when they returned, they told me the shed was empty, no chair, no clippings, nothing. They looked at me like I was crazy, like I'd made the whole thing up. I couldn't believe it. Joe had cleared everything out in the span of a few hours, leaving no trace behind. In the days that followed, Joe acted as though nothing had happened. He'd wave to me from his yard, that same eerie smile plastered on his face, his eyes glinting with something I couldn't quite place. I started avoiding my own house, spending nights at friends' places, jumping at every creak and shadow. The paranoia became unbearable. One day, a small package arrived at my doorstep with no return address. Inside was a single newspaper clipping, detailing a missing person case from the neighboring town. Scribbled on the edge was a note in Joe's handwriting: "Curiosity has consequences." I threw the clipping away, but the message was clear. He was watching me, and he knew he'd gotten away with it. I don't know what to do now, trapped in this silent battle, terrified of what he might do if I ever try to expose him. I always fancied myself a tough guy. Growing up in a rough neighborhood, you either learned to stand your ground or became a victim of someone else's. I took pride in my ability to shrug off pain, whether it was physical or emotional. I was indifferent, you see, a wall of cynicism built around my heart. I believed that vulnerability was for the weak. Life had taught me that everyone was out for themselves, and no amount of empathy could change that. But one chilly October evening, while walking home from my dead-end job at the corner store, an encounter turned my world upside down. The sun dipped below the horizon, and shadows grew long as I approached a familiar alleyway. I did the usual check for suspicious figures lurking in the darkness. That's when I heard it, a quiet sobbing, muffled but unmistakable. Curiosity got the better of me, leading me to the mouth of the alley. It was then I saw her, a teenage girl curled up against the brick wall, her knees pulled to her chest, tears streaming down her face. She was trembling, and I could feel an unwelcome twinge of unease crawling up my spine. Part of me wanted to turn away, chalk it up to some other kid's bad night, but instead, I found myself taking a tentative step closer. "Hey," I said awkwardly, immediately regretting the words. "Are you okay?" The girl looked up, her eyes wide and glazed, as if she hadn't expected anyone to notice her. "No," she croaked, her voice cracking like fragile glass. My gut tightened at the rawness of her pain, but the words barely registered as I tried to process what was happening. "What happened?" I asked, and to my absolute surprise, she started to pour her heart out. Her story tumbled from her lips in an avalanche of broken dreams and despair. She had just lost her mother to cancer and was forced to live with an abusive uncle who took every opportunity to reinforce how worthless she was. I stood there, feeling like a statue, my tough guy facade crumbling. It was hard to understand the pain she described. I had never been thrust into such darkness. While the stories I'd heard from friends about their families seemed trite compared to what this girl was enduring, something in me broke open. As she spoke, my mind whirled with fragmented memories of insults I had hurled to toughen people up, taunts I had ridiculed those vulnerable to fit in. My heart raced, and for the first time, I felt that crushing weight of empathy, the understanding of someone else's suffering resonating painfully in my own chest. I squatted down, trying to meet her gaze. "You're not worthless," I murmured, the words soft and awkward. "You're not alone, either." I expected her to scoff or roll her eyes, but instead, her tears flowed again, making her face glisten in the dim light. Something inside me shifted. I was no longer just an observer in her pain. I was a participant. We talked for what seemed like hours while the autumn air bit at our exposed skin. We shared stories, bonded over the cruel nature of the world, and by the time I left the alley, I felt a sense of weightlessness, the heaviness of my cynicism replaced by some small ember of understanding. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't shake the memory of that girl. I started to hesitate when ready to dismiss others' pain, considering instead how someone else might perceive their struggles. My coworkers noticed the slight change in me when I handed them the book I bought for a struggling friend. I started inviting friends out that I typically wouldn't have bothered. I wanted to do something meaningful for others, carrying the same compassion I found for that young girl into my everyday life. I often returned to that alley. I hoped to see her again. It didn't take long before I did. A week later, I found her sitting in the same spot. This time, she lit up at the sight of me. "You came back." Her face split into a smile, and I realized then how rare that was, considering the depths of her despair. I sat down next to her, and we picked up our conversations where we left off. I learned she loved drawing, an escape from her reality, yet her uncle had ripped that away by tossing her sketchbook in the trash. So, I bought her a new one. The next week, I brought her some colored pencils. She giggled through tears, and that sound was like music. Each time I returned, the laughter grew louder, the heaviness of her life felt lighter. She confided in me about her dreams, and I opened up about mine, a lifetime spent shielding myself from heartache and hiding my own fears beneath bravado. It was during that third visit that the shadows stretched long, and as we shared yet another deep laugh, I saw a figure at the alley mouth. The menacing build of her uncle loomed in the faint glow of the streetlight. My stomach dropped as I realized he was searching for her. My instinct kicked in. I grabbed her hand before she could speak. "Come with me," I whispered urgently, and we dashed deeper into the shadows, away from the growing threat. My heart raced, fear coursing through my veins. We zigzagged through alleyways until I led her to my tiny apartment in the next neighborhood over. She was terrified, yet trusting, and I couldn't help but feel the weight of her trust resting squarely upon my shoulders. For the next few days, she stayed with me as anxiety morphed into a new routine. I found myself protecting her more than I knew how, knowing by then the battles she faced. But all my efforts lay bare in stark contrast to the horrors waiting beyond my door. One cold evening, as we watched old cartoons and shared laughs, I heard an insistent banging. My heart sank. I looked at her, her eyes wide with terror. "It's him," she whispered. I rushed to the door, but the pounding continued, relentless. I told her to hide. She ducked into the bathroom, fear plastered across her face. I knew if he got in, he'd hurt both of us. I faced what courage I could muster, opened the door, and was met by her uncle's furious and bloated visage. "Where is she?" he spat, his eyes wild with rage. I stood my ground, but something in me felt small against the fury radiating from him. He shoved past me, and I instinctively lunged forward, desperate to protect her. The adrenaline surged through me, and a primal need to defend arose. I took a wild swing, hitting him squarely in the nose. He staggered back, momentarily disoriented, but it wasn't enough. He lunged at me, fist moving like a whirlwind. The next moments turned into a blur of chaos. We grappled, the dull ache of pain seeping into my muscles as I slammed against the wall, trying to keep him from reaching her. Each punch exchanged felt like snapping twigs in a silence shattered by muffled fear. It was a primal dance of brutality and instinct, and as he swung again, the sickening crunch of his hand against my ribs shattered my focus. Every blow that landed resonated with guilt. The thought of her seeing me become what I despised held me captive. But then I remembered her laughter, her dreams, her vulnerability intertwined with my newfound empathy. It fueled my resolve, surging through the pain. I drove myself forward, pushing him back, surprise etching across his face as I landed another hit. And finally, he stumbled back, gasping in a mix of shock and fury. "You think you can keep her?" he screamed, before taking off into the night. Breathing heavily, I turned to the bathroom. "It's okay. It's over." But when I opened the door, she wasn't there. Panic cascaded over me, a wave of despair flooding my heart. I searched frantically, calling her name, only to hear nothing but echoing silence. My worst fears spun out of control as the minutes felt like hours. I stumbled back into the living room, heart racing, when the door creaked back. I whipped my head up to find her standing there, trembling yet determined, clutching a small backpack filled with her drawings. "I'm leaving," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. My heart shattered. "No, you don't have to," I pleaded, the empathy I had found burning hotter than ever. "Stay. We can fight this together." But she shook her head, the weight of her fears anchoring her spirit. "You've been so kind, but I can't let him find me. You deserve better. You can't fight this battle for me." She turned to leave, her silhouette framed by the dim light of the hallway. And in that moment, I learned the hardest lesson of all, the depths of sacrifice, how empathy can compel someone to let go, to let a small flame flicker out for the greater good. I stood paralyzed with grief as she vanished, the intimacy we had built now a haunting memory. Days passed, then weeks. Life resumed its predictable course, but I carried her memories with me, each encounter echoing faintly in my heart. I still walked those alleyways, haunted by her absence, the harsh reality of her struggles serving as a constant reminder of my failure to protect someone so deserving. But through that pain, I learned something ineffably valuable, that no act of empathy is ever wasted. As I forged deeper connections with those around me, I began to understand humanity on a level I had never reached before, using that experience to reach others suffering in silence. I became their strength, their voice. Empathy had etched itself into my soul, a guiding light against the encroaching darkness. It taught me that our struggles are never in vain, that each connection, painful or beautiful, is a step toward healing. And as I closed my eyes each night, I hoped that wherever she was finding a sense of hope that I could one day share with others. The importance of empathy hadn't just changed me, it had saved me, marking the beginning of my journey toward not just understanding pain, but conquering it together. I've always been one of those kids who wanted to excel at everything, but despite my best efforts, it always felt like I was stuck in the shadow of my peers. In school, I was that kid who barely scraped by. I was the last to be chosen for teams and the one who flunked tests no matter how much I studied. But there was this one time, during my sophomore year of high school, that everything changed. It was during the science fair, and I had this incredible idea for an experiment that I was convinced would impress everyone. I spent weeks working on it, pouring my heart and soul into the project, at least, that's what I told myself. The truth is, I was so fixated on making it perfect that I overlooked all the crucial details. The night before the fair, I was still in my garage trying to get my final apparatus to work. It was supposed to demonstrate the properties of buoyancy using a homemade water filtration system. I was confident it would blow the judges away, but I should have known better. When I finally plugged everything in, a huge crack sounded as plastic broke, sending water gushing everywhere like a mini flood in my garage. My head swam with panic as I scrambled to salvage my ruined project, but in the end, it was a total loss. I felt the hot sting of tears in my eyes as I swept up the remnants of what was supposed to be my shining moment. The next day, I showed up to the fair with nothing but a poster covered in hastily drawn diagrams and a deep sense of shame. I remember standing there while other kids showcased their gleaming, perfect projects and feeling more and more invisible by the second. When it was my turn, I felt everyone's eyes scrutinizing my half-hearted presentation. I stammered through my lines, hoping to at least earn a participation ribbon. But I could see the blank expressions on the judges' faces. They barely asked me questions before dismissing me with a polite nod and moving on. It was a crushing defeat, but little did I know it was just the beginning of what felt like an endless cycle of failures. I became the punchline of a joke at school. Hey, remember that science fair that turned into a disaster? My heart sank each time I heard someone mention it. I started to believe I was destined to fail at everything, convinced that luck would never be on my side. But then one day, out of the blue, I received a mysterious message that would change everything. Late one night while scrolling aimlessly on Reddit, I stumbled across a post in a strange subreddit. The title read, "If you feel like a failure, maybe it's time to embrace the darkness." I was skeptical, but curiosity got the better of me. I clicked on it and found a thread filled with people sharing their own stories of failure, each more intense than the last. One user claimed that hitting rock bottom was the first step toward discovering a secret, hidden world. They shared that there was an underground gathering for people to confront their failures and find a way to rise from them. A part of me wanted to roll my eyes, but something deep inside drew me closer. The instructions were cryptic: find the old oak tree at the edge of the abandoned park after midnight, and you would find your answer. Initially dismissing it as a prank, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had nothing to lose. That night, I crept out of my house, my heart racing with a blend of anxiety and excitement. The air was thick with fog as I reached the park, and my flashlight barely pierced through the gloom. I found the oak tree, ancient and twisted, just like my current state of mind, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I was about to turn back when I noticed a faint glow coming from beneath the roots. Curiosity piqued, I kneeled, brushing away the dirt and revealing an old, weathered book. Its surface was coated in dust, and as I picked it up, I felt an odd sensation wash over me, like electricity. The leather binding was cracked, and the pages were filled with handwritten accounts of failures intertwined with strange rituals and practices. Most of it read like a combination of self-help mixed with ancient wisdom, yet my eyes were drawn to a particular passage titled The Ritual of Reflection. It described a way to confront your failures by literally facing them through guided meditation, allowing you to visualize each moment and learn from it. I almost closed the book right then, but something compelled me to continue reading. The next paragraph directed me to find a quiet place, close my eyes, and let my mind wander to my greatest failures. Unsure but desperate, I decided to follow the instructions right there by the tree. I sat down, closed my eyes, and took a deep breath. The moment I started to visualize, I was flooded with memories: the science fair, my embarrassment, the laughter of my classmates. Suddenly, it was as if I was transported back to that moment, feeling the heat of humiliation. But rather than sinking deeper into despair, I began to see the failure from a new perspective. I remembered the hard work I had put in, the lessons I had learned about planning and execution, and the fire that burned inside me to improve. It felt cathartic. The book instructed me to write down everything I saw, every lesson learned, and by the time I finished, the dawn was breaking over the trees. I had pages filled with scribbles that reflected my journey through each failure and the knowledge I'd gained. I returned home, adrenaline surging through my veins. The more I reflected, the more I realized that failure wasn't the end, it was just a stepping stone in my path to success. Over the next few weeks, I transformed my perspective on life. I dove into new projects, learning not to fear failure but to welcome it. I applied the lessons from that peculiar book, which I kept close at hand. The following year, I entered the science fair again, this time with a project on renewable energy that encompassed everything I had learned. The Transformation felt almost magical. I took each step with confidence, and when I presented, I held my head high. I even shared my past failure with the audience, how I had once seen it as a curse, only to recognize it as valuable ammunition. To my surprise, instead of hearing laughter, I saw nods of understanding. My project won first place that year, but even more than the trophy, I felt a deep sense of accomplishment. I continued to explore, embracing failures as lessons. I became an advocate for vulnerability in my school, encouraging others to share their stories. I had learned that failure wasn't something to hide from, it was part of our human experience. I still keep that old leather book, my silent guide. Whenever I face new challenges, I revisit those pages filled with my past mistakes, yet somehow, they feel less like failures now and more like building blocks. So, whenever someone asks me to share my greatest lesson, I smile, remembering the time I thought failure would break me but ultimately made me stronger. That old oak tree where I found the book has since been cut down for some reason, but I can still vividly recall sitting there, eyes closed, reflecting on my past mistakes, and transforming them into stepping stones. And now, anytime I see someone struggling, I always tell them the same thing: embrace your failures. You just might find that they lead you to the incredible journey of discovering your true self.
I woke up last night to the buzz of my phone on the nightstand. It's like piercing the quiet darkness of my room like a beacon. And when I glanced at the screen, my heart stopped. It was a text from my dad, the same dad who had been dead for 10 years, a chilling reminder of the day that shattered my world. My fingers trembled as I opened the message, half expecting it to vanish, a cruel trick my exhausted mind had conjured, but there it was, clear as day. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to leave you. The words felt surreal, a fragment of reality drawn from a nightmare, and I couldn't help but replay the events of that day in my mind. It was a rainy Thursday when everything changed. I was only 20, fresh out of college, when the phone call came. My mom's voice had quaked like a fragile leaf in the wind. "It's your dad, there's been an accident." Later they told me he had gone off the road, hit a tree, the usual horrors. I spent years grappling with the loss, battling the void that had opened in my life. A father who had been my rock, teacher, and biggest supporter had vanished without a trace, and I wrapped my grief in layers of silence, convincing myself I was fine until the day this message appeared. Curiosity mixed with dread as I typed the response: "Is this a joke?" Moments passed, and just as despair began to set in again, another message lit up my screen: "No joke. I'm still here." The hair on my arms stood upright, a visceral chill coursing down my spine. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears as I asked the only thing that made sense: how? Silence followed, stretching into an eternity before my phone buzzed yet again with a single word: wait. I couldn't breathe, the dread swirled around me, heavier than the air in the room, and I realized this was beyond what I could fathom. My mind raced, remembering the dark corners of research I had explored in an obsession to understand the realm beyond, stories of spirits trapped in limbo, lost souls reaching out to make amends, but I pushed those thoughts aside as the next text pinged: "I can't tell you now. But I want to see you." Tears pricked my eyes a moment before I could regain my composure. This wasn't right. My dad had never been the type to leave things unresolved, and yet, here it was, proof that something had gone profoundly awry. "You're dead," I texted back, my fingers flying across the screen, pounding out the absurdity of what I was being pulled into. His response was instantaneous: "What they told you wasn't true. Please, meet me." I felt a ripple of anger surface. How dare he? After 10 years of mourning, of carrying the weight of his absence, he had the gall to instigate this cryptic game. Where? The words came out sharper than I intended, but I had little left to lose. Standing before the specters of fog-shrouded memories, I was exhausted, and yet curiosity twinkled defiantly in the shadows of my mind. The answer was quick: the old park. That spot had haunted my dreams, the place we used to go every summer, where laughter echoed and picnic blankets sprawled under canopies of trees. I instinctively knew it was a bad idea, but I felt the pull, an almost magnetic urge to go, perhaps because deep down, I longed for closure. When I arrived, my heart pounded mercilessly as I pulled into the park lot, clouds stretching across the moonlit sky in ominous, swirling patterns. As I swung open the car door, a gust of wind swept past me, carrying whispers that seemed to beckon from beyond. I approached the old oak tree, its bark twisted and gnarled, remnants of our past visible in the shadows dancing around me. I could almost hear his voice, the familiar lilt that once brought warmth to my heart. "Dad?" I called out, and the name wavered in my throat, a fragile echo of hope. No response came, just the rustle of leaves in the cool breeze, until finally my phone buzzed again. Closer. I peered into the darkness, the shadows feeling alive, swirling, merging. Terrified, I moved forward, my feet leading me deeper into the heart of the park where we had shared so many innocent moments, my pulse racing in my ears as hope battled fear. "Dad," I cried, but the only reply was silence, thick like the fog that clung to my skin, freezing me in my tracks. "You shouldn't have come alone." The message came, and my heart dropped. It was different now, no longer just a disembodied text but a voice that reverberated through the night, stirring the emptiness in my chest. From behind the trees, a figure stepped forward, a silhouette cloaked in shadows, and despite the years, I knew that presence, the familiar outline of my father's frame. I stood frozen, paralyzed by disbelief and a swirling chaos of emotions, fear, anger, relief, but all I could muster was a strangled whisper, "What happened?" He stepped closer, and with every stride, the truth clawed at my mind. He looked just like I remembered, older, perhaps, but still undeniably him. "I can explain. I came back for you," he said, his voice almost a caress, but it was laced with something darker, something nameless that churned uneasily in the air. "You can't be here, you're dead," I gasped, my words slipping into the tension like a knife cutting through the atmosphere. He reached for me, his hand outstretched, but as I took a tentative step forward, something twisted behind him, a shadow shifting, revealing itself as a malevolent shape lurking just beyond sight, watching. "We don't have much time," he insisted, panic tightening the lines of his face, and my heart raced with a cocktail of confusion and desperation. "Please. Trust me." Something flickered in his eyes, a raw vulnerability that pulled me closer despite every instinct screaming to turn and run. "I'm sorry I left you, but you have to trust me now. It's not safe here." The words felt like gravel in my throat, and as doubt tumbled in waves through my mind, the shadow behind him seemed to grow, pulsing with anger, swirling. It was feeding off our fear, morphing into something sinister. I glanced back toward the parking lot. The safety of my car felt so far away in this moment, loneliness clinging to my heart like a shroud, but the urge to understand my father's words held me captive. "Who? What is that?" I forced myself to ask, confusion sparking a faint flutter of courage. "It's why I couldn't come back before. They're hunting me. You must go, now." His face contorted with pain, and everything inside me screamed to run, but loyalty to the man in front of me pushed my feet forward. "Dad, please." I begged, raw fear pouring out as I stayed rooted to the spot. But suddenly as he reached for me again, the shadow lunged, and my dad turned with an outcry, a howl that pierced the night, and in that instant, I understood, this was not a reunion, but a farewell. In an electrifying rush, the air thickened, crackling with energy, and I stumbled back, horrified, watching as he was consumed, as the darkness enveloped him in a circle of wrathful despair. "Run." It was all I could hear before the weight of the darkness began to wrap around my ankles, tugging at me as adrenaline propelled me forward instinctively. I didn't look back, I didn't scream, I stumbled through the trees, crashing through the twigs and brush of my childhood playground, the park echoing with a cacophony of phantom whispers that chanted warnings of the haunting shadows. I reached my car gasping, blindly fumbling to unlock the door and rushed in, slamming it shut as the darkness pressed against the windows, tormenting me with past regrets and grief, the air suffocating, thick with unresolved love and fear. I started the engine, my heart racing as I tore through the night, needing to escape the horrors of what I had just witnessed. As I sped away, gasping for breath, my phone flickered again, lighting up the dim interior, a final message from my dad, one that would haunt me forever. "I'll always love you, but now you must forget." With that, a shudder coursed through my body, and I was left with only silence, racked by loss, haunted by memories, forever tethered to the question of whether I would ever understand what truly happened that night at the old park. When my daughter Emily was born, I made it my mission to teach her the importance of sleep. I'd seen what sleep deprivation did to my friends, irritable moods, foggy minds, and even physical health issues, and I wanted to spare her that pain. At first, it was easy. I was strict about her bedtime, an unyielding routine that included winding down with soft music and reading her favorite stories until her eyelids grew heavy. But as she entered middle school, things took a turn. She began to fight the schedule. Friends invited her to late-night gaming sessions, TikTok trends lured her into binge-watching until dawn, and suddenly my well-behaved little girl transformed into a shadow of herself, exhausted and irritable. I tried to reason with her, reminding her that sleep was crucial, but she just rolled her eyes and spat back that everyone else was staying up late, so why couldn't she? Somewhere deep down, I knew the answer. I couldn't bear the thought of her becoming another statistic in a world that glorified burnout, but I also didn't want to be the bad dad. So, I doubled down, instituting a new rule: if she didn't respect her bedtime, there would be consequences. One day, during a particularly heated argument, I warned her that if she didn't get her act together, she might start to suffer the repercussions of her choices. Like what? She shot back, eyes sparking with defiance. I was hesitant, but in a moment of frustration, I blurted out that she'd never know what it felt like to truly be rested again, that she'd become a different person altogether. The next evening, after a particularly grueling day at work, I fell asleep early, too drained for the nightly routine. But in that deep slumber, I had no idea what was happening in the dark, cloistered corners of my home. I woke up in the middle of the night, driven by an inexplicable dread, the kind that makes your skin crawl. The house was still, too still, and I felt an urge to check on Emily. As I snuck into her room, I saw her sprawled across her bed, limbs awkwardly positioned, her poor body twisted in pursuit of sleep, but something about her face didn't look right, not peaceful, but almost vacant. I called her name softly, but there was no response, and panic began to claw at my throat. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a figure standing in the shadows of her room, tall and thin, with elongated limbs and a hollow face that seemed to absorb the light. It was watching her sleep, and for a moment, I thought I was losing my mind as the entity melted from the shadows, stepping closer to Emily. The air turned thick, suffocating, yet an odd pull urged me to step back and observe instead of acting. For reasons that remain lost on me, I hesitated. The creature touched her forehead, and that's when my instincts kicked in. I lunged toward her and yelled, "Get away from her!" My voice shattered the unnatural silence, and the ghostly figure dissipated like smoke, vanished into thin air, while I clutched my daughter's trembling body to mine, shaking her awake. She bolted upright, confusion clouding her eyes, and I couldn't find the words to explain what I just witnessed. "Dad?" she asked, sounding so small, but my heart was hammering, and I could only hastily tell her to stay awake, to keep talking to me, as if that would fortify us against whatever had been lurking in the shadows. When morning finally came, Emily didn't mention anything about the night before, but the exhaustion that clung to her reminded me of the horrors we had faced. It was a sleepless terror. I told myself it was only a figment of my imagination, spurred by consistent sleep deprivation, but then I noticed Emily's gradual change. She was more withdrawn than usual, her laughter a mere echo of what it used to be, and she spent most of her time in her room, not out of rebellion, but rather a haunting acceptance of her new reality. Days turned into weeks, and I felt compelled to keep a careful watch over her, to ensure that no specter would dare approach her again, but the weight of that commitment left an indelible mark on our relationship. One night, as she went to sleep, she looked at me and whispered an apology that unraveled my heart. She blamed herself for my worries, for not making better choices, but I told her that none of it was her fault. No one prepares you for the moment when your child becomes a vessel of something you can't control, just a shadow of oneself. It was just like I had foreseen. Repeated late nights had taken their toll, but now something else crept into the atmosphere whenever the sun set. The air felt charged with a different kind of tension, the kind you can't quite place, an unseen specter that seemed to thrive on our misfortunes. The nightmares began to visit Emily more frequently, whispers intertwining with her dreams, tales of delusions and darkness that left me sleepless beside her door, my heart thudding in an erratic rhythm sifted with regret and fear. I didn't know where else to turn or what else to do until I found myself seated with a therapist, a stranger who casually asked, "Have you ever thought about the consequences of enforcing such rules?" In that moment, I realized I hadn't considered how heavy my actions weighed on her young psyche. I was trying to protect her, yet the obsession with sleep had spun into a dark web of anxiety and fear, feeding the very thing I dreaded most. Desperate, I delved into late-night research, stumbling upon endless online forums where parents shared horror stories about supernatural beings that thrived on sleeplessness, and the pang of recognition clawed at me with every tale, each one echoing my own erratic journey since I'd set out to hold Emily accountable for her sleep patterns. Exhausted, I tried to bank on any sliver of hope and set up a cozy bedtime routine, complete with herbal teas and gentle meditation, aiming to soothe her soul, but each evening fell short of restoring the bond we once had. Then, One night, while peering through the darkened window, I caught glimpses of more than shadows. I saw it again, that same figure shrouded in the night's embrace, lurking just outside our home, waiting with outstretched fingers, alive with a resonance that shook me to the core. I knew I had to confront this menace once and for all, tearing away the veil of my childhood fears that had crept into our lives. The next day, after sleeping very little in days, I ventured out and found a library filled with tomes about sleep science, folklore, and the supernatural, anything that might offer a way to save my child. Hours blurred into frenetic tedium as I combed through volumes and tried to connect the dots among the whispered legends. I discovered relics of protection used in ancient cultures, such simple trinkets and charms that had defied prey to dark entities in slumber. That night, I gathered herbs and crafted talismans, all the while muttering incantations to shield Emily from the terror that had become our unwelcome guest. Undeterred by exhaustion, I guarded her sleep as she drifted off beside me, whispering words of safety. But as soon as she settled, I felt that familiar weight in the atmosphere once more. My heart raced as I glimpsed it at the window, a shimmering figure with hollow eyes, now glaring straight into the room. Summoning every ounce of courage, I confronted it, but instead of the malevolent force I had imagined, it spoke in a voice that echoed through the depths of darkness, promising that sleep was an illusion, a trap, and that I had tried to control it. "You taught her to fear it," it intoned, ominously dancing around the very truths I had overlooked. "But it only feeds my hunger." The ground shifted beneath me. The walls trembled with ancient whispers, and as I clung to Emily, I felt myself being torn apart, my resolve crumbling alongside my understanding of the balance between care and fear. As I tried to protect her, I realized that it wasn't just about bedtimes anymore. I had to face the truth of my failure in recognizing that sleep was not a destination we could conquer, but a road we needed to travel together. But in that moment of clarity, a chilling laugh echoed from the corners of our home. I'd become the very nightmare I sought to avoid, and in the end, it didn't even matter who was right or wrong. My daughter needed more than a record of discipline and dread. She needed a father who understood that sleep should not be a prison but a sanctuary from the darkness. And as I watched the figure retreat into the recesses of the night, I vowed never to let fear govern our lives again, knowing all too well that I might have already lost my way. In the weeks that followed, we found our rhythm anew, embracing the darkness not as a foe but as a part of ourselves, reminding one another to surrender to the night rather than fight against it. Maybe, just maybe, I'd still have time to teach her the importance of rest, not just for survival but for living, because even amidst our shadows, I began to believe in the soft embrace of dreams that awaited us, together, hand in hand against the darkness, ready to uncover the truth I had almost buried. And so I ask myself now, Ida, for teaching my daughter the importance of sleep? No, maybe I was the one who had yet to wake up.
I've never been one to believe in fate or anything mystical, but the day I realized my worth was nothing like I ever expected. It all started last fall when I took a job at a small, rundown bookstore just outside of town, a place called Whispers of the Past. I thought it would be a temporary gig, a way to pay the bills while I figured out my next move, but something about that place pulled me in. The moment I walked in, a bell above the door jingled like it was trying to warn me, but I didn't listen. The owner, a frail old man named Mr. Keller, was eccentric but kind, and he had a knack for finding the right book for every customer. He quickly became a mentor of sorts, sharing stories about authors long gone and the magic of words. However, there was this air of mystery hovering over the store, shadows danced in the corners, and the books seemed to whisper whenever I sorted the shelves alone. I brushed it off as my imagination or perhaps the ambience of the store, but little did I know, I was about to become part of a story even I couldn't have penned. It was just a regular Tuesday, rain streaked the windows as I huddled among stacks of dusty tomes. Mr. Keller was in the back, and I was thumbing through a collection of horror stories when I noticed an old leather-bound book, its cover unmarked and worn. Out of curiosity, I pulled it from the shelf. It felt alive in my hands. Flipping it open, I found pages filled with stories, but they weren't just stories. They were narratives of people's deepest fears, regrets, and dreams, written in dark ink that seemed to pulse. The strange thing was that the book showed a hint of something unusual. Each page bore the name of someone who had once owned it, along with handwritten notes in the margins. As I read, a chill crept up my spine. The words seemed to mirror my life experiences, my own failures and regrets. Each sentence felt like a dagger, but I couldn't look away. "This is crazy," I muttered to myself, not realizing I was not alone anymore. Mr. Keller watched me from the doorway, an unreadable expression on his face. That book has a history, he finally said, breaking the silence. It chooses its readers. My heart raced. Chooses its readers? What do you mean? It brings forth what you already know within. The worth that you struggle to see. Looking back at the pages, I felt a swell of emotions, a potent mix of hope and despair. I slammed the book shut, the echo resonating like the end of a reckoning. I can't deal with this right now, I confessed, the room suddenly feeling claustrophobic. I shoved the book back on the shelf, hoping to distance myself from whatever darkness it contained, but deep down, I knew it was already too late. The meaning it held clung to me like a shadow. That night, as I lay in bed, the whispers of the book filled the silence. My dreams twisted into nightmares, replaying my insecurities with vivid clarity. I was back in high school, forgotten in a corner at parties, my name called out like a punchline. I was passed over for promotions, always the last choice. I woke gasping, drenched in sweat, as realization slammed into me, I didn't truly value myself. The next day at the bookstore, I avoided the leather-bound book as if it were a venomous snake. I kept busy, helping customers, arranging displays, until the clock struck closing time. That's when I found myself staring at the old book again. Against my better judgment, I pulled it open once more. This time, as I read through the pages, a dull pain blossomed in my chest. The words began weaving themselves into a narrative, one that seemed to morph into my own story, my own voice spilling onto the pages. I found myself writing in the margins, pouring out my heart, my goals, my dreams, until, inexplicably, I felt lighter. As I penned my truth along with the fears of the previous owners, something within shifted. After what felt like hours, I closed the book, tears streaming down my face. I realized I had not just read the stories, I had rewritten the narrative in my own way. Mr. Keller approached, a knowing smile on his face. "You've found it, haven't you?" I nodded, my heart racing. I can't believe I let this define me for so long. In that moment, I truly saw my worth for the first time. My past didn't have to control my future, I could harness it instead. Over the next few weeks, I became a different person. I was no longer the wallflower at work. I spoke up during meetings, shared my ideas, even asked for a promotion, which I actually got. My relationships blossomed too. I reached out to old friends, rekindled connections that I had let fade away. The book had not just changed my perception of myself, it had opened the door to the life I truly wanted to lead. But the story didn't end there. One evening, as I prepared to close up the store, an eerie silence enveloped the room. I noticed an unsettling presence. The leather-bound book lay open on its own on the counter, its pages rustling as if beckoning me. I approached cautiously, heart pounding. Suddenly, words surged onto the page, visible to me alone. "Help us," they pleaded. I staggered back, confusion washing over me. "Who are you?" I whispered. The ink pulsed like a heartbeat. "Those who have lost their way, trapped within our fears. You have unchained your worth, now help us find ours." Panic rose within me. Could I really help others find what I had just discovered? The room darkened, shadows slithering along the walls, the air thickened, choking me. "We are the echoes of your past. Guidance comes not just from within, but through shared illumination. Use your voice." With every ounce of courage, I reached my hand forward, touching the page. Warmth enveloped me. It wasn't just a book anymore. I saw faces emerge, ghostly, familiar. They were my high school classmates, coworkers, friends who had struggled in silence. They were the lost, the broken, seeking connection. "Find your worth," I urged. "Speak it into existence. You are not alone." And then it happened. A rush of energy flowed into the room, spiraling around me, folding in on itself until it burst forth, illuminating the darkness with vibrant colors. I felt liberated, as if I were part of something beyond myself. In that moment, I realized my worth wasn't just about me, it was about helping others see theirs. The shadows receded, and the suffocating energy vanished, leaving behind the scent of rain and fresh pages. With the book now closed, I knew my life was intertwined with something greater than I could understand. I took it upon myself to share my story, to hold workshops where people could gather, express their fears, and learn to rewrite their narratives together. Whispers of the past became a sanctuary for so many, a place where lost souls found their voices. Every time a customer left with a newfound sense of self-worth, I felt a ripple of joy within me. I realized that the day I had discovered my worth was a turning point, not just for me, but for all the lives intertwined in the stories of that old leather-bound book. And every time someone found the courage to pen their narrative, I would remember, fate may be fickle, but worth is ours to claim. So here I am, just a person who dared to look into the shadows and found light, and it all started on that fateful day in a bookstore. When the bell jingles now, I know it doesn't just signal customers, it heralds the stories waiting to be written, lives ready to be reclaimed. And although I'm still writing my own story, every now and then, I feel the past whispering through the shelves, guiding me along the way.